What happens when a billion-dollar empire tries to erase one man's entire life? And he doesn't flinch. Victoria Sinclair had swallowed whole city blocks for breakfast. Mayors returned her calls. Investors flew in from 3 continents. She had never, not once, lost a deal. Then she walked into Ethan Mercer's garage, and everything she thought she knew about power, value, and what people are willing to fight for collapsed. This is the story of a single father, a rusted building, and a secret so extraordinary it stopped a billion-dollar machine dead in its tracks. Stay until the end, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Victoria Sinclair came to Riverton for the first time, the sky was the color of old dishwater, flat gray, low clouds sitting on the rooftops like they had nowhere better to be. She rode in the back of a black SUV, her phone pressed to her ear, barely glancing at the neighborhood sliding past her window. She didn't need to look. She had seen the reports. She had seen the aerial photographs, the property assessments, the market comparisons. Riverton was exactly what her team had described, a worn-out pocket of the city that had been quietly falling behind for 30 years. Cracked sidewalks, chain-link fences, corner stores with hand-painted signs, buildings that looked like they were being held together by habit and stubbornness more than any actual structural integrity. "We're 2 blocks out," her driver said. She pulled up a document on her phone. One remaining acquisition. One single property blocking the final corridor of the Sinclair Meridian development. A project that would pour nearly $2 billion into this city's tax base, create thousands of jobs, and replace this crumbling stretch of underperforming real estate with something that actually mattered. One holdout, one man. She ended her call and finally looked out the window. The garage appeared on the left side of the street like an afterthought. A squat, faded structure squeezed between a vacant lot and a shuttered laundromat. The painted letters above the roll-up door had bleached almost entirely to nothing. Mercer's Auto. The roof had a rust stain running along one edge that looked like a long brown scar. The concrete apron out front was cracked and oil-stained, dark patches soaked into the surface over what must have been years, maybe decades. Victoria studied it for a moment as the SUV slowed. "That's it?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." She almost smiled, not out of cruelty, more out of the specific confidence of someone who had negotiated with senators, with hedge fund managers, with old money families who hadn't paid their property taxes in 6 years, but still believed their land was worth twice the appraisal. This? This was a tired old building in a neighborhood nobody was fighting over. She straightened her jacket, grabbed her portfolio, and stepped out. The garage smelled like motor oil and metal shavings, and something else underneath those. Sawdust, maybe, or old cardboard. A small radio on a shelf near the door was playing something low and indistinct. 2 work lights hung from the ceiling on cables, casting a yellowish glow over a mid-90s seat sedan that sat with its hood open, mid-surgery. A man was bent over the engine. He didn't look up when she walked in. "Mr. Mercer?" "Yep." He kept working. His hands were buried in something she couldn't see, and she could hear the clinking of a ratchet. "I'm Victoria Sinclair. I'm with Sinclair Development Group." She waited for the kind of reaction that name usually produced. A shift in posture, a pause, some physical acknowledgement that she had arrived. "I believe my office has been in contact with you several times over the past 4 months," he said. 11 letters, 3 phone calls, 2 visits from people I'd never met." He pulled the ratchet out and straightened up. Ethan Mercer was not what she had expected. She wasn't entirely sure what she had expected. Something more defeated, maybe, or more defensive. Instead, she found a man in his early 30s with grease on his forearms and a calm, unhurried expression that felt almost deliberately inconvenient. He wasn't hostile, he wasn't nervous, he was just present. Like a man who had decided a long time ago exactly where he stood and had no particular interest in being moved. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her with dark eyes that took her in without much visible reaction. "I know who you are," he said. "Then you know why I'm here." "I know what you want," he said. "That's not the same thing." He tossed the rag onto the workbench and leaned back against the car. He crossed his arms, not aggressively, just settling in, like he had all day. Victoria opened her portfolio. I want to be direct with you, Mr. Mercer. My team has made several generous offers for this property, and we've been patient, but we're entering a critical phase of construction. The Meridian project represents a $2 billion investment in this city. It will create 4,200 permanent jobs, he said. I read the press release. She paused. Then you understand the scale of what we're trying to accomplish. I understand what you're trying to accomplish. He glanced around the garage briefly, the way someone might glance at their own living room. Familiar, reflexive, unconscious. Doesn't mean I'm in your way. With respect, Mr. Mercer, you are directly in the way. Your property sits at the center of our final corridor. We cannot build around it. Sure you can't, he said. Not mockingly, just flatly. Like he'd already had this conversation 100 times in his head and had stopped finding it interesting. She set the portfolio on the workbench and turned it to face him. The number on the top page was the kind of number that tended to stop conversations. It was well above assessed value, above market, above what any legitimate buyer would pay for a property in this condition, in this neighborhood. He looked at it. He didn't move. That's a serious offer, she said. It is, he agreed. More than this property is worth by any reasonable measure. Something shifted in his expression, just barely, just at the corners of his eyes. Not anger, something quieter than that. Depends on what you're measuring, he said. She waited for more. He didn't offer it. Mr. Mercer, I'm not selling. He picked up the ratchet again. You're welcome to leave that number with me, but it won't change. I'm not selling. She stood there for a moment. In her experience, people who said I'm not selling at this stage meant you haven't offered enough yet. The body language usually gave it away, the way they kept their eyes on the number, the way they needed you to convince them more than they needed you to leave. But Ethan Mercer had already turned back toward the engine. He wasn't waiting for her to say something more. He was done. Victoria closed the portfolio. She looked at the garage one more time, the stained floor, the rattling ceiling fan, the old shelves crowded with filters and socket sets and cans of penetrating oil. Her eyes moved to a steel door set into the back wall. It was heavier than the rest of the building, she noticed. Newer. The frame looked reinforced. There was a digital keypad mounted beside it, the kind you'd find on a secure storage unit or an equipment vault. It was the only thing in the place that didn't look tired. She filed it in the back of her mind and walked out. We'll see. The debriefing in the SUV lasted 4 minutes. He said no, she told her chief of operations, Daniel Forsyth, without preamble. Daniel was 47, built like a retired linebacker, and had the kind of unshakable loyalty that came from being underpaid for 12 years before finally being paid extremely well. He sat in the passenger seat with his tablet open and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. How firm? He asked. Very. She was quiet for a moment, watching the garage disappear in the side mirror as the SUV pulled away. But he's not angry. He's not performing. He just... She searched for the right word. He's comfortable. Comfortable can be a negotiating position. I know what a negotiating position looks like, Daniel. She looked out the windshield at the street ahead. This was something else. He waited. What's actually in his file? She asked. Full background. 40 years old. He's 32, she said immediately. He looked it up. You're right, 32. Sorry. Opened the garage 6 years ago. Before that, Daniel scrolled. Not much. Some employment records, mechanical work. Prior to that, there's almost nothing publicly available. He's got a daughter, 7 years old, mother deceased. Wife, she passed 4 years ago. He glanced up. There's not a lot here, Victoria. He's not connected to anything significant. He knew the job numbers from our press release. Anybody can read a press release. He read it carefully. She tapped her fingernail against the window. He's not as simple as this looks. Find out what's in the rest of the file. Anything older. Otek. Riverton had been many things over its 100-year life. In the 1920s, it was a working-class neighborhood built around the rail yards, close-packed houses, corner taverns, Catholic churches on alternating blocks. In the 50s, it got a little money and put up some small commercial strips. In the 70s, the rail yards closed and the money left, and the neighborhood didn't so much decline as deflate, slowly, like something losing pressure over a very long time. By the time Ethan Mercer moved in, Riverton had achieved a particular kind of stasis that long-neglected neighborhoods sometimes settle into. Not dead, not thriving, just existing. The people who lived there had mostly been there long enough that leaving felt less like an option and more like a kind of defeat. They knew each other's names, they shoveled each other's walks in winter, they complained about the same potholes to the same city councilman who had been promising to fix them for 9 years. Then the Meridian announcement came. At first, nobody was sure how to feel. The money was real. The renderings looked like something from a different city entirely. Glass towers, wide plazas, restaurants with outdoor seating and little potted trees along the sidewalk. The development company held a community meeting in March at the rec center on Halloran Street. Victoria's people brought architects and consultants and a short film about urban revitalization. Most of the property owners in the target zone had started selling within 90 days. Not because they were pushed. Some of them, a lot of them, were ready, tired, holding on to properties that were costing them money to maintain. The check from Sinclair Development wasn't just fair. For many of them, it was the solution to a problem they'd been carrying for years. But not everyone. A woman named Ruth Okafor had cried when she signed the papers for her mother's house. She had grown up in that house. Her mother had been born in that house. But Ruth was 63 years old and her children lived in other states, and the furnace had broken twice in 3 years, and in the end the money was real and the house was just a house. A man named Dennis Kwan had held out for almost 2 months before Sinclair's people found out that the tile shop he was running had 3 violations in arrears and a silent partner who badly needed liquidity. The deal had been quiet and quick. One by one, the holdouts had resolved themselves. And then there was just Ethan. Rosa Delgado had worked at Mercer's Auto for 3 years. She was 26, practical, capable, with a torque wrench, and deeply unimpressed by the general tendency of people to underestimate her. She had come to Ethan looking for part-time work and had ended up full-time within 2 months because it turned out she had a better intuition for electrical systems than anyone else in the shop. She was in the office, a cramped room in the front corner with a desk, a filing cabinet, and a space heater that only worked if you kicked it once on the left side. When Ethan came back in from seeing the woman in the suit out, "How'd it go?" Rosa asked without looking up from the invoice she was processing. "About how you'd expect. She try the guilt trip or just go straight to the big number?" Ethan sat down in the chair across from her desk. He stretched out, long legs extending, and stared at the water-stained ceiling for a moment. "Big number. Then a short version of the guilt trip." Rosa put down her pen. "Big number like big enough." She looked at him. "Ethan, I know." I know, Rosa." She sat back. She had been through enough of these conversations to know where they went. Early on, she had made arguments, practical, numerical arguments about what the money could do, about what it would mean for him and his daughter. He listened to all of them. He didn't argue back, he just said, "I know," and then didn't change his mind. And after a while, she had started to understand that his reasons weren't the kind of reasons you could address with math. "She seemed competent," he said. "Sure she did. She's worth $2 billion. Her company is." Same thing, basically. Rosa picked her pen back up. "What did she make of the place?" He was quiet for a moment. "She thought it was nothing," he said. There was no resentment in it. He said it the way you'd report the temperature outside. A fact noted, filed. "And the back room?" She didn't ask. He stood up. She noticed it, though. Rosa watched him walk back out toward the garage floor. That was the thing about Ethan Mercer that took some getting used to. He saw everything. He just chose very carefully what he said about it. First, the garage had been his wife's idea, technically. Her name was Kara. She had been a structural engineer. Smart, precise, funny, in a dry and sudden way that caught people off guard. She had grown up in a different part of the city and had no particular attachment to Riverton when they first moved there, but she was the kind of person who put down roots fast, who learned neighbors' names and remembered kids' birthdays and brought food when someone was sick. So by the time they'd been there 2 years, it had become, quietly and without ceremony, her neighborhood too. Ethan had been working as a senior engineer at Callaway Dynamics, one of the largest automotive R&D firms in the country, when they moved to Riverton. He was good at his job in the way that occasionally produced genuine awe in his colleagues, the kind of good that's harder to explain than it looks, because it isn't really about technical knowledge so much as about an almost unreasonable ability to see how things should fit together. He could look at a design problem that had been sitting on a team's whiteboard for 3 weeks and find the wrong assumption in about 40 minutes. He didn't talk about it. He was just good at it, the way some people are, and he got paid well and traveled sometimes and spent the rest of his time at home with Kara and eventually with their daughter Lily. He had been designing something in the last year before everything changed. A prototype, a car, technically, though that word barely covered it. It was a project he worked on in the evenings and on weekends, a personal obsession he had been quietly feeding for years, based on a set of engineering principles he had developed himself, things he had never seen done quite this way before. Kara used to bring him coffee and sit on the workbench and ask questions, and sometimes he would explain things, and sometimes he would just talk and she would listen. And those evenings were, in retrospect, the kind of ordinary perfection that you only fully recognize after it's gone. She got sick in the spring. It was fast enough that fast feels like the wrong word, fast like falling, like the ground appearing where there used to be distance. By the following January, she was gone. Ethan took a leave from Callaway. Then he took another. Then they stopped asking when he was coming back because the answer had become obvious to everyone. And 6 months later, he quietly resigned. He moved the project here, to the garage. He bought it with part of the savings they'd been keeping for a bigger house someday, got the licenses he needed, hired a mechanic named Walt, who was 63 and partially deaf and completely uninterested in anyone's personal history, and opened for business. The project lived behind the steel door. Nobody had been through that door except Ethan, and for a brief period a retired engineer named Felix Drummond, who had worked with him at Callaway and driven 8 hours to spend a weekend looking at the prototype and had left, saying almost nothing except, "It's not done yet, is it?" And Ethan had said no, and Felix had said, "You'll know when it is," and driven back home. That was 2 years ago. Lily Mercer was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes, large and dark brown and startlingly direct, the kind of eyes that made adults feel slightly accountable. She went to Riverside Elementary 4 blocks from the garage, walked there with a neighbor's kid named Marco most mornings, and came to the garage after school on the days that Ethan didn't have after-school pickup arranged with Rosa or with Mrs. Patterson next door. She did her homework at the desk in the front office. She had opinions about music. She had recently decided that her favorite food was anything spicy, and had been testing this claim with varying levels of success. She had never once asked her father why he hadn't sold the garage, because she was 7 and it was their garage, and the question wouldn't have made sense to her. On the afternoon after Victoria Sinclair's visit, Lily came in with her backpack and dropped it in the office chair and found her father in the garage floor lying under the sedan on a creeper, his feet sticking out. "Dad, hey, Bug." Marco said his mom said someone came to buy the garage again. Did you say no again? She considered this. Was she mean? He rolled out from under the car and looked at her. There was a streak of grease along his jaw. "No," he said honestly. She was just wrong. Lily accepted this the way she accepted most things her father said, with a nod and no follow-up, the instinct of a child who had learned that her father meant what he said and said what he meant, which made further questioning mostly redundant. "Can I have a snack?" "There's an apple in the mini fridge." "I want something good." "There's also crackers in the desk drawer." She wrinkled her nose but went to find the crackers. Ethan lay back down and rolled back under the car. Above him, the undercarriage was a familiar landscape of corroded bolts and cracked rubber, and the patient disorder of something that had been running past its service date for a long time. He worked in silence for a while. He thought about the woman in the suit. He thought about the number in her folder. He thought about Kara, the way he thought about Kara roughly 500 times a day. Not always with sadness anymore, just with a kind of constant low-grade awareness of absence, like checking a watch that isn't there. The garage was Kara's, not legally, not on paper, but in the way that mattered. She had thought it was a good idea. She had helped him paint the sign. She had said, "This is where you should be," in the way she said things. Without drama, without ceremony, just clearly, as a statement of fact that she had thought about and found true. He wasn't selling it. He wasn't going to sell it. Band. The letters started arriving more frequently after Victoria's visit. 3 from different law firms. 1 from the city's Department of Building Inspection. 1, oddly, from an environmental services company that wanted to discuss potential soil contamination remediation on the property, which was interesting because nobody had mentioned soil contamination before. Ethan put them on his desk and read them carefully. He had always read carefully. Rosa read them too, over his shoulder, and her jaw got progressively tighter with each one. "That's the city," she said, pointing to the inspection notice. "That's not a coincidence." "Probably not." "Ethan, they can shut you down. If they find violations, there are violations," he said calmly. "Every building this age has violations. The question is whether somebody decides to care about them. And now somebody does. Now somebody does." He put the letters back in a neat stack. "So we'll fix what needs fixing and document everything we do. Get receipts, dates, everything in writing." "That takes money. We don't have a lot of it right now." "I know." He looked at the stack of envelopes. "I'm going to make a phone call." The phone call was to a man named Ray Costello. Ray was 58 and had been in the automotive world for most of his adult life. Not as an engineer, but as a dealer, a broker, a connector of people who had things with people who wanted things. He had met Ethan years earlier at a private auction in Cincinnati, and they had stayed loosely in touch the way 2 people do when they recognize something useful in each other without being quite sure what it is yet. "They're coming at you from the inspection side?" Ray said. "Looks that way." "That's the play they use when the money doesn't work." He paused. "How much did they offer?" Ethan told him. A short silence. "That's a real number." "I know." "And you're not taking it?" "No." Another pause. Ray was not a man who asked a lot of personal questions. He dealt in facts and favors and the particular currency of having been around long enough to know who was who. "What do you need?" "I need a good structural engineer to look at the building and document its actual condition before the city inspector gets here. I want a clean baseline, on record, before anyone starts finding problems." "Done. Who else?" "That's the other call I need to make. You know Jordan Macy at the Courier?" "I know of her. I need to get her out to the garage on a specific day. I need her to see something." Quiet. "Is this about the back room?" Ethan paused. "You know what's in there?" "I've heard things." Felix talks more than he thinks he does. Ray's voice shifted, not to excitement exactly, but to the particular alertness of someone who has just understood a chess position more clearly. "If you show that to a journalist, I know what happens. Victoria Sinclair is going to have a very bad week." "That's not why I'm doing it." Ethan's voice was flat, matter of fact. "I'm doing it because I need people to understand what this place actually is before someone gets a judge to sign a demolition order based on a cracked drain pipe." "All right," Ray said. "I'll set it up. Give me a week." Jordan Macy was 34, had been at the Riverton Courier for 7 years, and had long since made her peace with the fact that she worked for a local paper in a mid-sized city covering the kinds of stories that national outlets only noticed when they had already become something larger than themselves. She covered city council. She covered neighborhood disputes. She covered the small, grinding machinery of civic life that most people affected by it paid no attention to. Ray called her on a Tuesday. She was skeptical, as she was of most tips that came through intermediaries. But when Ray explained, but not everything, just enough, she listened more carefully. "A mechanic," she said. "Not exactly," Ray said. "More complicated than that." "What's behind the door?" "That's what he wants to show you." She drove out to Riverton on a Wednesday afternoon 2 weeks later, notebook in her bag, camera in the car. The neighborhood was as worn as advertised. The garage was small and unremarkable. A young woman at the front desk, Rosa, who looked at her with the particular wariness of someone accustomed to people showing up and making assumptions, led her through to the garage floor, where a man in work clothes was finishing up with a customer's truck. He finished, wiped his hands, shook hers without ceremony. "Thanks for coming," he said. "Sure." She looked around. "So, what exactly am I looking at?" He met her eyes. "I'll show you in a minute. First, I want to ask you something." She waited. "What do you know about automotive engineering?" he asked. "Almost nothing." "Good," he said. "That means I'll have to explain it like it matters, not like it's technical. That's better." He turned and led her toward the back of the garage. "Have you talked to anyone from Sinclair Development yet? They've pitched me the Meridian project a few times. Press releases, a briefing last fall. And it's a big development story. I'm covering it." She paused. "I'm not in anyone's pocket, Mr. Mercer, if that's what you're asking." "I'm not asking that." He stopped in front of the steel door. He turned back to look at her, and something in his expression was different from the way it had been a moment ago. Not nervous, but something more like careful. The expression of someone who is about to do something they've been holding back for a long time and isn't entirely sure how they feel about doing it. He punched in the code. The lock disengaged with a sound like a vault releasing. He opened the door. The room was cold, not unpleasantly, more like a controlled climate, deliberate and steady. The kind of temperature you maintain when preservation matters. And what it was preserving. Jordan Macy stopped in the doorway. She had no particular reverence for cars. She used one to commute and serviced it when the dashboard told her to. But she was not immune to the experience of walking into a room full of things that were, unmistakably, extraordinary. 8 cars sat in the space, not parked haphazardly, arranged the way you'd arrange something you cared about, with clear sightlines and soft lighting that made each one look like an exhibit. She recognized almost none of them by name, but she recognized the quality, the particular stillness of things that have been maintained as a form of love. Chrome that reflected without a single fingerprint, bodywork that absorbed the light rather than deflecting it. "These are," she started. "Collector cars," Ethan said, stepping in beside her. "Some of them are worth a lot. That one," he gestured to a long, low thing in dark green, "hasn't been seen publicly since 1974. There are 4 in existence. I found it in a barn in rural Kentucky 6 years ago and spent 14 months restoring it." She looked at him. "6 years ago, you were just getting started here." He moved further into the room. "These aren't what I wanted to show you." He walked to the far end. In the back of the room, partially covered by a custom-fitted cloth, was something that was not like the others. It was lower and more aggressive. Even under the cover, you could read its posture. The way it sat on the floor, the proportions, something about the way its corners turned. It occupied space differently than anything else in the room. He pulled the cloth back. Jordan was quiet for a long moment. "What is that?" she said. "That," Ethan said, "is what I've been building for the last 4 years." He explained it the way he'd said he would, like it mattered, not like it was technical. He had begun the design at Callaway Dynamics, he said, as a private project, a proof of concept for a propulsion and chassis architecture that had never been fully realized in a production context. He had solved, over time, a series of engineering problems that the automotive industry had been circling without quite cracking. He talked about weight distribution, about energy recapture, about a specific geometry in the suspension design that he had worked out on paper over about 8 months before he was sure he had it right. He did not say this will change the industry, or this is the future of automotive engineering. He talked about it the way someone talks about a thing they know very well, precisely, with a kind of restrained intensity that was more convincing than any amount of enthusiasm would have been. Jordan wrote for 45 minutes without stopping. When she finally looked up, she said, "Why now? Why are you showing me this now?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because someone is trying to tell people this place is nothing," he said. "Before they can do that, I want someone to see what it actually is." "And you think this," she gestured at the car, "changes that?" "I think," he said, "that when people know what's in this room, they'll have a harder time believing that shutting it down is in anyone's interest except one person's." Jordan looked at the car again. It sat there, unfinished, in some sense, still waiting for something, but unmistakably itself. The kind of thing that made you understand why some people gave everything to an idea for years without knowing if it would ever be finished. She thought about Victoria Sinclair. She thought about the Meridian Project. She thought about the inspection notices she'd heard about, the letters from law firms, the sudden municipal attention on a building that had been fine for 6 years. "You know," she said, "this is going to be a very complicated story to write." "I know," Ethan said. He sounded like he'd expected that. 3 weeks later, Rosa found him in the garage at 10:30 at night. He was sitting on an overturned crate with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, looking at nothing in particular. The garage was quiet. Lily was at Mrs. Patterson's for the night. The city inspector was scheduled to come in the morning. "You should sleep," Rosa said. "I know." She sat down on another crate. The overhead lights were half dimmed and the space felt different at night, larger somehow and more still. "Are you worried?" she asked. He considered the question. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "When Kara was sick," he said slowly, "there was a period, about 6 weeks before the end, where I could see exactly how it was going to go. Not because the doctors told me, but because I knew. And I remember thinking that the worst part wasn't the knowing. The worst part was that there was nothing left to figure out. All I could do was be there." Rosa was quiet. "This is different," he said. "This I can still figure out." He stood up. He rinsed out the coffee cup. He turned off the last remaining light and walked to the back room to check the climate control setting, the way he did every night. The prototype sat in the dark, patient and still, waiting to be finished. He put his hand on the hood for just a moment. Then he locked the door behind him and went home. The city inspector showed up at 8:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before he was scheduled to arrive, which was either a coincidence or a small power move. Ethan had learned to stop assuming things were coincidences. His name was Gerald Fitch. He was in his mid-50s, carried a clipboard with a practiced air of bureaucratic authority, and wore the expression of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that nobody was ever happy to see him. He had a younger colleague with him, a woman named Trainee Something, who wrote things down and said nothing. Ethan was already there. So was the structural engineer Ray had sent, a compact, silver-haired woman named Dr. Patricia Huang, who had her own clipboard and her own camera and had arrived an hour earlier and done a thorough walkthrough before Fitch appeared. Her report was already half written. That had been the point. "Mr. Mercer," Fitch said, not unkindly. "Shall we get started?" "Go ahead," Ethan said. He followed them through the building at a measured distance, watching Fitch work. The man was professional enough. He checked the electrical panel, noted 2 breakers that were outdated but functional. He checked the ventilation, noted insufficient airflow in the main bay, which was true and not new. He checked the bathroom plumbing. He checked the fire suppression system, which was current, inspected 8 months ago, certificate on file. He checked the exterior drainage, which had a partial blockage on the east side that Ethan had noticed himself and had already put on his repair list. Each item Fitch noted, Dr. Huang photographed and logged independently. Each time Fitch wrote something down, she wrote something down. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Fitch was aware of her, the way you're aware of someone watching you work, and Ethan noticed the inspector become slightly more careful after the first 15 minutes, more deliberate, less interpretive. When it was over, Fitch handed Ethan a preliminary findings sheet. 7 items. 3 minor. 2 moderate requiring correction within 60 days. 2 significant, one involving the drainage and one involving an outdated load-bearing assessment on the rear wall. "We'll need documentation of corrections within the timeline noted," Fitch said. "Understood." Ethan looked at the sheet. "I'd like to note for the record that an independent structural assessment was completed this morning prior to your arrival, documenting the baseline condition of the property." He handed Fitch a copy of Dr. Huang's preliminary findings. Fitch looked at it. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted. A small recalibration. He was a professional. He understood what a parallel documentation trail meant. "That's your right," he said carefully. "It is," Ethan agreed. After they left, Rosa appeared from the office doorway where she'd been standing with her arms crossed and her jaw set the entire time. 7 violations, she said. 7 manageable violations, Dr. Huang said, snapping her camera case closed. Nothing here would justify emergency closure. If someone tries to use this for a demolition order, they'd have a fight on their hands in administrative court, and they'd lose. Slowly, but they'd lose. She looked at Ethan. Get the drainage cleared this week. Get the load-bearing assessment scheduled. Document everything with dates and receipts. That's your insulation. Thank you, he said. She shook his hand and left. Rosa watched her go. Ray's people are good. Ray's people owe him favors. Same thing. She looked at him. How long can we do this? The repairs cost money. The lawyer who looked at those letters cost money. Every time they push, it costs us something. I know. We're not a big operation, Ethan. I know, Rosa. He folded the inspection sheet and put it in his back pocket. His voice was patient but not dismissive, the tone of someone who had already done the math and didn't particularly enjoy the result. 2 months. I need 2 months. For what? He looked toward the back of the garage, toward the steel door, the way he sometimes did without seeming to realize it, the way people look toward things they're thinking about even when they're not talking about them. For the story to land right, he said. She exhaled through her nose. It wasn't agreement exactly, but she didn't push further. That was the thing about working for Ethan. He didn't always tell you everything, but the things he did tell you had a way of turning out to be true. Jordan Macy's article ran 11 days later. It appeared in the Wednesday print edition and went online at 6 in the morning. A feature piece, 4,000 words, with photographs that Jordan had taken herself inside the climate-controlled room. The headline was straightforward enough. Inside a Riverton garage, a secret collection, and an unfinished dream. Below it, the subheading, as a billion-dollar development closes in, one engineer turned mechanic is still working on something nobody knew was there. By 9 in the morning, it had been shared 1,400 times. By noon, a national automotive blog had picked it up under a different headline. The Lost Engineer, Callaway Dynamics' former prodigy, has been building something in a Riverton garage, and linked Jordan's piece with 17,000 words of its own speculation about the prototype. By 2 in the afternoon, Ethan's phone had received calls from 3 journalists he'd never heard of, a documentary filmmaker, and a man who claimed to represent a private automotive museum in Switzerland and wanted to discuss the 1974 dark green car. He let most of them go to voicemail. Rosa answered the one she could and told the rest they would be in touch. The comment sections, which Ethan did not read, but Rosa read with the focused attention of someone monitoring a weather system, were a mix of the predictable and the surprising. Automotive enthusiasts arrived in force, arguing about the technical specifications of the prototype with an intensity that was impressive given that Jordan's article had been deliberately vague about the engineering details. Local Riverton residents, many of them, showed up in the comments not to talk about the cars but to talk about the neighborhood, about what Sinclair Development had done, about the inspections and the legal letters, and the way the whole process had felt to people who had been watching from adjacent blocks. Someone named Driveway King 74 is writing 3-paragraph comments about your suspension geometry, Rosa told him, reading from her phone. He seems pretty confident about what you got wrong. What does he think I got wrong? Something about the anti-dive characteristics. Ethan was quiet for a moment. He's not entirely off. Rosa stared at him. That's not... You know what? Never mind. What the article did, more than anything else, was change the texture of the situation. Before, the story of Riverton's last holdout had been a minor footnote in the larger Meridian narrative, a development company waiting out a stubborn property owner, a bureaucratic timeline ticking down. Sympathetic, maybe, to anyone who thought about it, but not particularly dramatic. A small human story inside a large economic one. Now it was something else. Now there was a specific thing at stake, not just a building or a man's memories, but a one-of-a-kind prototype vehicle that had never been seen publicly, designed by an engineer whose former colleagues were, once the automotive press started making calls, describing him in terms that required some adjustment to the narrative of man run struggling garage and declining neighborhood. He was genuinely exceptional, one former Callaway colleague told a reporter from an industry publication on Background, not the loudest person in the room, never the one pitching himself, but give him a problem, a real one, not the kind with an obvious solution, and he'd come back with something that made you rethink your assumptions. We were sorry to lose him. The industry publication ran those quotes in a piece that ran 2 days after Jordan's article. It was titled simply, "Who is Ethan Mercer?" It was a question that had not previously occurred to most people to ask. Inside Sinclair Development, the question was asked more urgently and with considerably less warmth. Victoria found out about the article the same way she found out about most things. From Daniel, who appeared in her office at 7:15 in the morning with his tablet already showing the headline, his reading glasses on, his expression carrying the specific neutrality of someone delivering information they know is going to produce a reaction. "It ran this morning," he said. She read it standing up. She read it in full, which took her longer than she expected because Jordan Macy wrote with a kind of unhurried precision that didn't allow for skimming. When she finished, she put the tablet down and walked to the window. Outside, the city was going about its morning. 40 stories below, traffic moved in the slow, thick way it moved on Wednesdays. "The inspections," she said. "I know. Were they—" She stopped. She asked the question differently. "Who authorized the timing on the inspections?" Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That came through the city liaison office. Standard process for active development zones." "Standard process." She turned from the window. "Daniel, were they targeted?" He met her eyes. He didn't look away, which she appreciated. One of the things she valued most about Daniel was that he told her the truth even when the truth was inconvenient. "The request was put in after the second refusal," he said. "It was framed as routine, but the timing was deliberate. Legal reviewed it. They said it was within the boundary of what's permissible." Within the boundary? She sat down. She felt something she didn't entirely have a name for. Not guilt, exactly. Not yet, but something adjacent to it. A friction. And the soil contamination letter? That was a third-party firm. Also within— "I know what within the boundary means, Daniel." She picked up the tablet again and looked at the photograph Jordan had taken of the prototype. Even in a photograph, through a journalist's camera, there was something about it. "This is going to be a problem. The automotive piece is getting traction. It's mostly industry coverage so far, but it won't stay industry." She put the tablet down again. "Someone with money is going to read that and call him. Someone with money and an interest in protecting what's in that room. We still have a legal path on the construction timeline." "I know we have a legal path." She said it evenly, without sharpness. She wasn't angry at Daniel. She was something else. Recalibrating. "Get me everything on Callaway Dynamics. I want to understand exactly what he was doing there and why he left." She looked at the ceiling for a moment. "And find out if the city inspection report has any vulnerabilities. If this ends up in front of a judge, I want to know what we're actually standing on." Daniel wrote it down. He started to leave. "Daniel," he stopped. "Is anyone on my team in contact with that city liaison office, directly, with names attached?" A pause. "Probably." "Make sure there's nothing in writing that connects our office to the timing of those inspections." Her voice was flat and factual, not conspiratorial. The voice of a person managing risk, not hiding something. That was the distinction she made for herself quickly, and then moved past it. "Go." He went. She sat alone in her office for the first time that morning and let herself think clearly for a few minutes. She was not a person who had built $2 billion in development by being careless with the truth. She was, in her own accounting, someone who operated aggressively but within the rules, who pushed hard for outcomes she believed in, who sometimes made things difficult for people who were in the way, but who did not break things that weren't hers to break. That was the story she told herself. It was not entirely wrong. But the inspection timing, the soil letter, the law firm letters from 3 different firms in the same week. She hadn't ordered any of it directly. But she had built a team that understood what outcomes she needed, and sometimes teams found ways to produce outcomes that their leaders had plausible distance from. She had known this, abstractly. She had let it be abstract. Now it was in a newspaper, and the abstraction had a face. She pulled up the article again on her own phone. Read the part about Lily. 7 years old, mother deceased, homework done at the front desk of a garage. She put the phone face down on the desk. The legal team sent her a memo by midday, 6 pages. The conclusion was that Sinclair Development remained on solid footing on the construction timeline, that the city violations, if uncorrected, provided a viable administrative pathway to a forced closure, and that Mercer's documentation efforts, while prudent, were unlikely to survive a well-resourced challenge. Well-resourced. She was well-resourced. She read the memo twice. Then she closed it and did not respond to it, which was unusual for her. What she did instead was pull up Ethan Mercer's file, the full one now, the one Daniel had compiled over the past 10 days. She started at the beginning, with Callaway Dynamics, and read forward. She read about the projects he'd led. She read about the prototype and the engineering notes that Callaway had kept on file that described his theoretical work in terms that her MBA-trained brain couldn't fully parse but could understand the significance of. She read about Kara. Not much, because there wasn't much in any formal record, just the death certificate and a brief obituary in the city paper that described a structural engineer beloved by her colleagues and her neighborhood, survived by her husband Ethan and daughter Lily, age 3. She read about the garage, the license application, the renovation permits, the early years of modest but steady business. She read about the collector cars, which Ray Costello, whose name appeared in several automotive dealer records, had helped broker acquisition on, and which were worth, collectively, far more than anyone looking at the building from the outside would have guessed. She sat with all of it for a while. Then she called her general counsel, a sharp woman named Sandra Park, who had been with the firm for 5 years and who was one of the few people in the building who would tell Victoria what she actually thought. Sandra, hypothetically, if we push this to administrative closure and it went wrong, if the documentation trail on the inspections became a public story, how bad is it? Sandra didn't hesitate. Depends on how wrong. Best case, bad optics during a sensitive phase. Worst case, we're the company that weaponized city inspections against a widowed single father to take his dead wife's garage. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. Right. You asked. I did. Thank you. She ended the call. She stood at the window again. The city below was indifferent, as cities are. She had been wrong about the building. She had seen it and written it off in 4 seconds, the way she sometimes wrote things off when they didn't fit the category she'd already assigned them to. That was a fault she was aware of in herself. She moved fast, and she was right more often than not, but she moved fast, and sometimes fast meant careless. She had been careless about Ethan Mercer, but she wasn't sure yet what to do about that. In Riverton, the morning after the article ran, Ethan arrived at the garage to find 3 people standing on the sidewalk outside. 2 of them were automotive enthusiasts who had driven from the next city over and wanted to know if they could see the collection. The third was a woman in her 70s named Alma, who had lived 2 blocks away for 40 years and had never come into the garage before, but had read the article and wanted to tell him directly that she was glad he hadn't sold. He thanked her. He didn't let the other 2 inside. Rosa dealt with the media requests, which continued to arrive. She had developed a system involving a spreadsheet and a standard response email, and she handled it with the same practical efficiency she applied to everything. She was good at managing the surface of things while Ethan managed the underneath. The underneath, at this moment, included a structural engineer who needed to complete the load-bearing assessment by Friday, a drainage contractor who had given him a quote that was higher than he'd wanted, and a letter from a law firm, a 4th law firm, new, different from the previous 3, suggesting that the Sinclair Development Group was prepared to pursue an expedited administrative review of the property's compliance status. He read the letter at his desk with the mild attention of someone reading the weather forecast for a day they already have plans for. New one? Rosa asked from the doorway. 4th firm. He set it down. They're getting serious about the administrative track. What does that mean practically? It means if we don't correct everything on the inspection list and prove it, they can push for a review board hearing. A review board can recommend forced closure without a full court proceeding. He picked up his coffee. It's faster than a lawsuit and more expensive to fight. Rosa leaned against the door frame. Ethan, we need to talk about money. I know. Actually talk about it. Numbers. He put down the coffee. He didn't argue, because she was right. They spread the books on the desk and went through it with the thoroughness of 2 people who understood that ignoring reality was a different kind of expensive. The repairs, the legal consultations, the months ahead, with no guarantee of when the pressure would ease or whether it would. It was tight. Not impossible, but tight in the way that tight got worse faster than you expected. "I can cover 3 more months," Rosa said, "if we don't lose any more major clients, if nothing breaks, and if the drainage fix doesn't go over, quote. After that," she spread her hands. "Ray offered to front the drainage repair," Ethan said. "Ray already did the engineer and the journalist contact. You can't keep taking from Ray. He's not doing it out of charity. He knows what's in that room." "You should let someone buy one of the cars," Rosa said quietly. "The Swiss Museum guy has called 3 times. Ethan looked at the desk. His jaw worked once. "No. Ethan, they're not for sale." He said it without heat, but there was something behind it that Rosa recognized, the particular immovability of someone whose reasons had been decided at a level that arguments couldn't reach. "Not yet. Not like this. Not because someone is squeezing me." She looked at him for a long moment. She had a lot of things she could have said. She'd learned over 3 years to be selective about which ones she actually said. "Okay," she said finally, "then we need another way." He nodded slowly. "There's something I've been sitting on." He opened the desk drawer and pulled out a printed email, a message he'd received 4 days earlier that he hadn't yet responded to. "You know the Harman Institute?" She didn't. "It's a nonprofit that supports independent engineering research, mostly academic, some applied work." He slid the email across the desk. "They read the article. They want to come see the prototype." Rosa read the email. Then she read it again. "They're talking about a research partnership. Potentially. Ethan, if they partner with you on the prototype, if they have any kind of institutional interest in what's in that room, that changes the legal picture completely." "I know." "Sinclair can't push for administrative closure on a building that houses an active research project with institutional backing. The liability exposure is completely different." "I know, Rosa." He met her eyes. He wasn't smiling. He rarely was. But there was something there that she'd seen only occasionally, something that looked like the satisfaction of a person watching a plan take the shape they'd imagined for it. "That's why I haven't responded yet. I wanted the drainage assessment on record first. I wanted Jordan's article out and circulating. I wanted a clean sequence." She sat back. She looked at the ceiling. She let out a slow, controlled breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "You're playing this like a chess game," she said. "I'm playing it like someone who can't afford to lose." She handed the email back. "When are you going to call them?" "Today." He looked at the letter from the 4th law firm, still sitting on the corner of the desk. "This afternoon, before they have a chance to schedule the review board." He picked up his phone. But before he could dial, the front door of the garage opened, and neither of them were expecting what walked through it. It wasn't a journalist. It wasn't an inspector. It wasn't someone from the automotive community who'd read the article and made the drive. It was a girl. 12, maybe 13. Wearing a school uniform that Ethan recognized, St. Catherine's, the private school on the north side of the city. The kind of school that produced the kind of children who grew up to be Victoria Sinclair. She had dark hair, straight and precise, and the slightly stiff posture of a kid who'd been told her whole life to stand up straight and had made it a habit. She looked around the garage. She looked at Ethan. "Are you the guy from the newspaper?" she asked. Rosa glanced at Ethan. He set his phone down. "Depends on the newspaper," he said. "The one about the cars." "Yeah," he said. "I'm him." The girl looked around again, at the tools, the lift, the sedan half-finished in the main bay, the general organized disorder of a working garage. She seemed to be processing something. "My mom is Victoria Sinclair," she said. A beat of silence. Rosa went very still. Ethan's expression didn't change. "I know who your mom is," he said. "She doesn't know I'm here," the girl said quickly, with the preemptive guilt of someone who understood they were doing something that would require explaining later. "I took the bus." "Okay," Ethan said. She looked at him. She seemed to be working up to something. "The article said you have a daughter." "I do." "How old?" 7. Something moved across the girl's face. A quick, unguarded thing, gone almost immediately. My dad's not around either, she said. Not with self-pity, just as a statement. Ethan said nothing. He waited. I wanted to see the cars, she said. Is that... can I? He studied her for a moment. She stood there with her school bag and her precise posture and her eyes that were Victoria Sinclair's eyes. Sharp and assessing and not quite willing to show what they were thinking, except she was 13, and 13 doesn't have as much practice at hiding things as 30. What's your name? He asked. Isabel. How'd you get here, Isabel? Bus 14, then walked from Halloran. He nodded slowly. He looked at Rosa, who gave him the particular expression she deployed when she thought something was probably a bad idea, but knew she wasn't going to say so. Come on, Ethan said. He walked her through the garage. He didn't make a production of it. He showed her the sedan he was working on, explained in simple terms what was wrong with the fuel injection and why it mattered. She asked a question, a specific one, not a polite one, about whether the problem could have been avoided with different maintenance, and the question was good enough that he gave her a real answer. Then he took her to the steel door. She stood in the doorway of the back room and looked at the collection the same way Jordan Macy had, with the specific arrested quality of someone whose expectations have been exceeded without warning. She walked along the row of cars slowly. She stopped in front of the dark green one. This one's oldest, she said. How'd you know? The proportions. Everything's longer. She looked at him. I'm not a car person. I just know old things look different. He almost smiled. 1974, he said. She kept moving. When she reached the prototype at the far end, she stopped and didn't say anything for a full 30 seconds. Is this what you're trying to finish? She said. Yeah. What's it for? Is it for selling? Or it's for being right, he said. And then, because that sounded possibly more strange than he intended, some things you build because you want to solve the problem. The problem's been sitting there for a long time. She looked at him again. Her voice, when it came, was quieter than it had been. My mom thinks you're just holding out for more money. I know she does. Is she wrong? Yeah. Isabel looked at the prototype. She seemed to be deciding something. She's not a bad person, she said. I know how it probably looks, but she actually does believe the project is good for people. She talks about it like it matters, the jobs and the development, and she stopped. She doesn't always see the whole thing. Ethan looked at the car. People rarely do. You don't have to let her off the hook, Isabel said with a dry frankness that was startling coming from a 13-year-old. I'm not, he said. They stood there for a moment in the cold, quiet room with its careful lighting and its extraordinary contents. You should probably call her, Ethan said. Let her know where you are. Isabel grimaced. Yeah. You can wait in the office if you want. Rosa will get you something to drink. She nodded. She looked at the prototype one more time. I hope you finish it, she said. Then she walked back through the garage, her school bag on one shoulder, her posture still precise, and her face showing more than she probably knew. Ethan stood alone in the room for a moment after she left. He thought about what she'd said. She doesn't always see the whole thing. He understood that. He'd been guilty of it himself, in different ways and different rooms. He thought about Kara, who had been better at seeing whole things than almost anyone he'd known, who had told him once, during a late conversation in the kitchen of their old apartment, that the mistake people made with problems was treating them like puzzles, fixed, solvable, with one right configuration, when most real problems were more like weather systems, things you had to move through, not solve. He walked back to the office. Rosa looked at him. Well, she said. Call the Harmon Institute, he said. Tell them I can meet Thursday. She reached for her phone. He picked up his own, looked at it for a moment, then set it down. In about 40 minutes, he expected, a black SUV would appear outside the garage, and Victoria Sinclair would step out looking the way she always looked, precise, prepared, in full command of the surface of whatever situation she was entering. But her daughter had gotten here first, on bus number 14, and had stood in the back room and looked at the prototype with the unguarded eyes of someone who hadn't yet learned to protect herself from being moved by things. It had not resolved anything. but it had shifted something in the small and specific way that the truth sometimes shifts things, not with a crash, but with a quiet pressure, working its way into the structure, finding the places where the assumptions were holding weight they couldn't support. He sat down at the desk and waited. The black SUV arrived in 38 minutes, which was faster than Ethan had expected, and suggested that Isabel had called her mother sooner than she'd let on. Victoria stepped out without the portfolio this time. No prepared documents, no folder of numbers. She was wearing the same kind of clothes she always wore. Everything fitted, everything intentional, but there was something different in the way she moved toward the garage door. Less like an executive arriving for a negotiation, and more like a person who was angry and trying to decide how angry she was allowed to be in public. She stopped in the doorway. Isabel was sitting in the office chair with a can of ginger ale Rosa had found in the back, her school bag at her feet, doing something on her phone with the focused indifference of a teenager who has decided that whatever is about to happen is not, technically, her fault. Isabel? Victoria's voice was controlled, tight. Hi, Mom. We'll talk later. She shifted her eyes to Ethan, who was leaning against the workbench with his arms crossed. Not because he was being territorial about it, but because he'd been standing that way when the SUV pulled up and hadn't seen a reason to change. Mr. Mercer. Miss Sinclair. A beat. She looked around the garage briefly, taking it in differently this time, he thought, not dismissing it, actually looking. She's not in trouble, he said. She was polite. She asked good questions. Victoria's jaw moved once. Thank you for that. It came out slightly stiff, which was the sound of someone saying something they meant but weren't used to saying. I apologize for... She didn't do anything that needs apologizing for. He said it evenly. She wanted to see the cars. I showed her. Victoria looked at her daughter again. Isabel had put her phone down and was watching the adults with the particular attention of a kid who understood that something real was happening and was trying to read it accurately. Did you show her the... Victoria paused. All of it? Yes. Something passed across her face that Ethan couldn't entirely read. She turned back to him. She seemed to be deciding something, some internal negotiation happening behind her eyes. Can I ask you something? She said. Not the voice she'd used on her first visit. Something different, slightly less armor in it. Sure, he said. The prototype. She said it carefully, like she was testing the word. Is it finished? No. How close? He looked at her for a moment. Why? Because I read the Callaway files, she said. I had my team pull everything available on your work there. The internal assessments, the project notes, the peer reviews. She paused. You were working on something that their own engineering board described as potentially significant, not in a press release way, in a technical way. And then you left and nobody outside that company seems to have known what happened to it. He was quiet. I made assumptions about this place, she said, about what it was. I'd like to understand what I got wrong. It was not an apology, but it was something honest, and Ethan had more patience for honesty than he did for most other things. He looked at Isabel, who was very carefully pretending not to be listening. Rosa, he said, can you take Isabel to get something from the deli across the street? Rosa looked up from her desk. She looked at Isabel. She looked at the two adults. She made the quick calculation of someone who had survived 3 years of working for Ethan by understanding when to step out of the way. Sure, she said. Come on. She collected her jacket. Isabel collected her bag with the practiced speed of a teenager who recognizes a diplomatic exit. When they were gone, the garage settled into a quiet that felt different, the kind of quiet that only happens when a space has been cleared on purpose. Ethan pulled the second stool from under the workbench and set it in front of him. He nodded at it. Victoria looked at it, then sat down. He sat on the edge of the workbench opposite her. It was not a conference room. There was oil on the floor and a half-rebuilt engine 6 feet away, and the faint smell of metal and rubber. She didn't seem to mind, or at least managed to seem like she didn't. The prototype isn't finished, he said, because there's a calibration problem I've been working on for 8 months. Not structural, not mechanical, computational. The feedback system that manages the energy recapture. I have the theory. I've had it for a long time. But getting it to work at full scale requires a level of processing architecture that I've been building piece by piece, and there's one component I haven't been able to manufacture correctly yet. He said it plainly, without frustration. The way you describe a problem you've accepted will take as long as it takes. It's close, probably 6 months out if nothing interrupts it. Victoria listened without interrupting, which he noted. And the collection? She asked. I built the collection because I needed to fund the project. The collector cars generate income, auctions, commissions, restoration fees. The garage pays its own bills. Together, they've kept the prototype work alive. He looked down for a moment. When Kara died, I had a choice between doing something practical and doing something real. The garage was both. She was quiet for a moment after he said that. Not the silence of discomfort, more like the silence of someone who has just had their understanding of a situation reorganized from the ground up. I told my team you were holding out for more money, she said. I know. I believed it. A short pause. I've been in this business for 8 years, and almost everyone who says they're not about the money is eventually about the money. It's not cynicism. It's just pattern recognition. I understand that. You're not a pattern I recognized, she said. Not as a compliment exactly, as an acknowledgement. He looked at her directly. What are you here for? He asked. Not for Isabel. What did you actually come here for? She held his gaze. I'm not sure yet, she said, with a frankness that surprised him slightly. I came because my daughter was here and I was worried, but now… She looked around the garage again. I want to understand how we got here, how my company got to the point of filing inspection complaints against a… She stopped herself. Against you. Against someone who wouldn't sell, he finished without accusation. Yes. The word was flat and uncushioned. She didn't try to soften it. He thought about Kara again, about what she would have made of this woman sitting on a stool in their garage, trying to see something she'd missed. Kara had been better than he was at giving people the room to arrive at things. She didn't require people to have already figured it out before she extended them any credit. The inspection timing wasn't random, he said. No, Victoria said. It wasn't. The soil letter was someone in your network. Likely. And the 4 law firms in 3 weeks. That was coordinated. He nodded. He appreciated that she wasn't pretending. I'm not going to ask you to fall on a sword about it, he said. I understand how development works. I understand how pressure works. I've been in enough rooms where outcomes were managed through adjacent pressure rather than direct action. He looked at the floor. What I want is for it to stop. Not because it hasn't worked. It's cost me money and time and sleep. But because I'm going to fix everything on that inspection list, I'm going to get institutional backing for the research project, and every additional thing your team does to pressure me is going to land on the public record, which now has ears it didn't have 6 weeks ago. Victoria looked at him steadily. You're not threatening me. I'm explaining a situation, he said. There's a difference. There is. She put her hands in her lap. She looked tired, he thought. Not physically, but in the way that people sometimes look tired when they've been running a story in their head for a long time and have just discovered the story was wrong. I doubled the offer this week. I told Daniel to prepare the paperwork. I know. He called Rosa yesterday. You haven't responded. No. She exhaled, not with frustration, with something more like the release of a person who has been trying to solve a problem by increasing the force applied and has finally accepted that force is not the variable that matters. What would it take? Not money. I understand it's not money. What would it actually take? He looked at her. This was the question he'd been waiting for, not impatiently, but the way you wait for the right moment in a mechanical process. The moment when the components have reached the position where the next step can happen. A conversation, he said. Not today. A formal one. With your legal team and mine, and some people from this neighborhood. He picked up a socket wrench from the bench behind him and turned it in his hand without looking at it. I have some conditions. Not about this building. She watched him. What then? The neighborhood, he said simply. He didn't say more than that, and she didn't ask. Not yet. She seemed to understand from the way he said it that this was not a negotiating opener. It was a statement of category. The thing at stake was not the building and not the money and not the prototype. The thing at stake was something that had been standing here for decades before Victoria Sinclair arrived with her renderings and her community meeting. They sat in the quiet for another minute. Outside, through the garage's front windows, Ethan could see Rosa and Isabel coming back from the deli. Isabel was eating something wrapped in paper and had her phone in her other hand. Rosa was talking, which meant Isabel had asked her something, because Rosa didn't talk unprompted to people she'd just met. "She's perceptive," Ethan said, nodding toward the window. Victoria looked. Something softened around her eyes. "She gets that from her father," she said. Then, "Which is annoying." He almost laughed. It was close enough to a laugh that she seemed to catch it. "Thursday," he said. "I have a meeting with the Harmon Institute in the morning. After that, if you want to talk, actual talk, not offer papers, call this number." He wrote it on the corner of a work order sheet and handed it to her. It was the same number she already had, but the gesture meant something different from the gesture of handing it over the first time. She looked at it. She folded it once and put it in her jacket pocket. Rosa and Isabel came back through the front door. Rosa was mid-sentence about something involving carburetor cleaning, which meant Isabel had asked about the cars, and Rosa had made the practical pivot she always made when people showed real curiosity about mechanical things. Isabel looked between her mother and Ethan and performed a quick read of the room. "Is everything okay?" she asked, with the wary calibration of a teenager who has caused something and isn't sure yet how bad it is. "Yes," Victoria said. "He didn't yell at you?" "No," Victoria said. "Did you yell at him?" "Isabel." The girl returned to her food, apparently satisfied. Rosa sat back down at her desk and picked up where she'd left off. Victoria stood, and for a moment she just stood there, in the middle of Ethan Mercer's garage, with all its smell and clutter and history, and looked like a person who was in the middle of changing her mind about something and wasn't entirely comfortable with the process. "Thursday," she said. "Thursday," he agreed. She left. Isabel followed, pausing at the door long enough to raise one hand in a half wave at Rosa, who raised one back. Then the SUV door closed, and they were gone. Rosa waited approximately 4 seconds. "What happened?" she said. "Progress," Ethan said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I have right now." She looked at him. "You're not going to tell me what you talked about." "Later." He picked up the socket wrench again. "Call the Harmon Institute and confirm Thursday." The meeting with the Harmon Institute happened in a conference room at a midtown hotel, which was their suggestion and the kind of neutral ground that everyone in a complicated situation tends to prefer. There were 2 of them, a man named Dr. Marcus Webb, who ran the Institute's Applied Research Division and had the rumpled, distracted quality of someone whose mind was always operating at a slight angle to the current conversation, and a woman named Priya Anand, who was the Institute's Legal and Partnerships Director and had the opposite quality, fully present, precise, saying nothing she hadn't already decided to say. Ethan came alone. That was a choice. Rosa had offered to come and he'd said no, not because he didn't trust her judgment, but because some meetings required the simplicity of one person across from another. Marcus Webb spent the first 15 minutes asking technical questions about the prototype. Real questions. Not soft opener questions, but specific, detailed questions that revealed he had read everything available and had thought carefully about it. He asked about the feedback calibration problem. He asked about the computational architecture. He asked about the suspension geometry that Driveway King 74 had opinions about online. Ethan answered directly. He didn't inflate what was finished or minimize what wasn't. He said this works when it worked, and this is the problem I haven't solved when it wasn't. And Webb listened with the engaged quality of someone hearing confirmation of something they'd already suspected. Priya Anand listened to all of it without writing anything down, which meant she'd already read whatever Webb had sent her and was using this meeting to evaluate something other than the technical merits. When there was a lull, she said, "Tell me about the garage situation." He did. He kept it factual. The inspections, the letters, the administrative review threat, the article, the institutional backing question. He laid it out as a sequence of events without editorializing much. And if the administrative review proceeds, she asked. We'd fight it. We'd probably win eventually. But eventually is expensive and uncertain. What does institutional backing from the Harman Institute actually solve? He looked at her. He liked that she'd asked it that bluntly. It changes the legal character of the space, he said. Right now, the garage is a commercial property with code violations. With a research partnership, it becomes a protected research facility with active institutional oversight. The threshold for forced closure is significantly higher and more publicly costly. You've been talking to a lawyer. I've been reading, he said. There's a difference. She almost smiled. What do you need from us? A research partnership agreement, formal affiliation of the prototype project under the Institute's research portfolio, access to your engineering consultants for the calibration problem. I'd pay that through the partnership, not as a grant. And, he paused, a letter of institutional interest on file with the city's development office, documenting the research activity at the site. The letter being the part that changes the administrative picture, Webb said. Yes. They looked at each other. The brief private communication of two people who work together well enough that they don't need words for simple agreements. We'd want quarterly progress reports, Priya said, standard for affiliated projects. And when the prototype reaches a testable stage, we'd want right of first documentation, not ownership, documentation. The Institute publishes research. This would be part of that record. That's acceptable. And the collection, Webb said. He said it carefully, like he'd been waiting to mention it. The collector cars. We don't have standing to protect those under a research partnership. If Sinclair Development pursues a different legal avenue, the collection is my concern, Ethan said, not the Institute's. I'm just flagging the exposure. I understand. He looked at the table for a moment. I'm working on that separately. The separately was the Swiss Museum, which had called 4 more times and was now offering a consulting arrangement. Not a sale, a long-term loan agreement, which was different in the way that mattered. The cars would remain his. They would spend part of the year in Geneva, properly displayed and maintained. The arrangement would generate income and, more relevantly, create an international institutional relationship that would be very inconvenient for anyone trying to claim the space had no significance beyond its market value. He hadn't told Rosa about the museum arrangement yet. He would, soon. Webb said, "We can have the partnership documents drafted by end of next week." "I'd need them before Tuesday," Ethan said. Priya looked at him. "That's specific." "There's a review board meeting being scheduled. I need the documentation before it's formally filed." She wrote something down, the first thing she'd written the entire meeting. "We'll have them by Monday." He thanked them. They shook hands. Marcus Webb, on the way out, paused and said, "I'd like to come see it, the prototype, when you're ready." "Thursday afternoon," Ethan said. "If you're free?" Webb's face did the thing that faces do when someone has just said yes to something they'd been wanting to be asked. "Thursday afternoon," he said. The Tuesday before the Monday document deadline, 3 things happened in the same day, which had the quality of a situation that had been building pressure for weeks and was now releasing in several directions at once. The first was that the drainage contractor finished the repair and handed Ethan a completed work order with date stamps and photographs, which Rosa immediately uploaded to the formal documentation file she had been maintaining with the fastidiousness of someone who understood that this file was a legal instrument, not a record. The second was that a reporter from a national outlet, not automotive, General's News, called to say they were developing a story about development tactics in mid-sized American cities and wanted to interview Ethan about the inspection and legal pressure timeline. He said he'd think about it, which meant he called Ray, who said to wait until the review board question was settled. The third was that Daniel Forsyth called Rosa's line and asked for a formal meeting on behalf of Sinclair Development, and when Rosa asked what the meeting was regarding, Daniel said, "We'd like to discuss a revised approach." Rosa came to the garage door where Ethan was working on a '98 Civic that a neighbor had brought in with a transmission complaint. "They want a meeting," she said. He was under the car. "When?" "They said whenever is convenient for us." He rolled out on the creeper and looked at the ceiling. "Whenever is convenient for us" was not language that Sinclair Development had used before. It was the language of a party whose negotiating position had shifted enough that they needed to acknowledge the shift. Thursday, he said, after Webb's visit. You're going to make the CEO of a $2 billion company wait behind a researcher. I'm going to have the researcher there first so the CEO sees what the space is before we talk, he said. There's a difference. Rosa thought about this. That's either very smart or very annoying. Can be both, he said, and rolled back under the car. Webb came Thursday at 2. He spent 90 minutes in the back room. He was the opposite of Jordan Macy. Where Jordan had been a journalist learning to understand what she was looking at, Webb was an engineer encountering something he had partially expected and was now confirming at the level of physical reality. He moved around the prototype with the focused quiet of deep competence, asking questions that were so specific they barely felt like questions, more like thinking out loud with someone present. At one point he crouched beside the rear suspension and said, almost to himself, "You actually solved the geometry problem." Mostly, Ethan said, the anti-dive is, he worked through something silently. Elegant isn't the right word, it's more like, correct, Ethan said. Yes. Webb stood up. He looked at the prototype with the expression of a man who has been shown something real. The calibration issue. Your computational architecture. Can I see your current build? Ethan showed him. They stood at the work table that ran along the left wall of the back room, spread with annotated drawings and printed circuit diagrams, and for 45 minutes they talked in the specific, abbreviated language of two people who share enough technical framework that they can move fast. Webb had thoughts. Some of them were useful. One of them, about a modified approach to the sensor array, was genuinely interesting, the kind of idea that opened a door Ethan had been standing in front of for a while without being sure it was a door. He wrote it down. At 3:45, Webb shook his hand at the garage door and said, "Monday, you'll have the documents," and left. At 4 o'clock, Victoria Sinclair arrived. This time she brought Daniel and one other person, a woman who was introduced as Claire Nguyen, Sinclair Development's head of community relations, which was a title that had not previously appeared in any interaction with Ethan, which told him something about what had changed inside the company. He met them in the garage. He didn't take them to the back room. Not yet. They stood in the main bay, Ethan and Rosa on one side, the three Sinclair people on the other, with the unfinished Civic between them like a piece of furniture that nobody wanted to address directly. Victoria looked at Ethan. She looked like she hadn't been sleeping much. He recognized the specific quality of that, the slight thinning around the eyes, the way a person's face gets when they've been running the same set of thoughts too many times. "I want to be direct," she said. "I know," he said. "We're withdrawing the administrative review request." Rosa went still. Ethan kept his face steady. "When?" "It was filed this morning. The withdrawal, I mean. The review board meeting won't be scheduled." She said it without drama, without making it a gift. Just a fact. The reversal of a previous decision. The soil contamination firm has also been instructed to cease contact. And the law firms? The 4 firms were contracted for specific advisory purposes. Those contracts are complete. No further filings are anticipated. A pause. "Daniel can provide written confirmation if you need it." "I need it," Ethan said. Daniel nodded and made a note. The room was quiet for a moment, not an uncomfortable silence, more like the silence after something that had been running loud finally stops and everyone is briefly adjusting to the change in sound. "I came," Victoria said, "because I want to have the conversation you mentioned, about the neighborhood." She looked at Claire Nguyen briefly. "Claire leads our community engagement work. She's been reviewing the Riverton acquisition process and has some concerns she brought to me directly." Ethan looked at Claire Nguyen, who was in her mid-40s with a direct gaze and the slightly wary quality of someone who works inside a large organization and has had to fight for her concerns to be heard. "What kind of concerns?" he asked. "The pace of the acquisition process," Claire said. "Several properties were acquired in contexts that raised questions afterward. We had a standard fair market offer process, and in most cases that's what happened. But in some cases," she paused. "Dennis Kwan's tile shop, the Okafor property, a few others. There were..." Additional pressures that I don't think were appropriate and that I didn't know about when they were happening. Ethan looked at her steadily. You're telling me this now? Yes. Why? Because you're the one left, she said without defensiveness, and because the article made me read the file more carefully. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Victoria. Is she saying this with your knowledge? Yes, Victoria said. Then why didn't you say it? A beat. Because I'm still deciding how much of this I own directly, and how much was done by people who understood what I needed without me asking for it. She said it with the specific discomfort of someone who has looked at their own behavior carefully and doesn't entirely like what they found. That's not an excuse. It's the honest version of where I am. He respected that more than a clean apology would have meant, which would have felt like a performance. All right, he said. He pulled the stool out again, the same one she'd sat on before. She sat on it. Daniel and Claire found places on the bench along the wall. Rosa sat at her desk in the doorway and didn't pretend she wasn't listening. And they talked. Not a negotiation, not a meeting with prepared positions and agenda items. A conversation, the kind that moves sideways and backtracks and sometimes arrives somewhere nobody planned. Ethan talked about Riverton the way someone talks about a place they know from the inside, not its history as a data point, but as a living thing. The way neighborhoods accumulate meaning through specific people doing specific things in specific buildings over a long time. He talked about Ruth Okafor's house, not to condemn the sale, but to make it concrete, to put a face on what acquisition meant when it became personal. He talked about what the Meridian development could give the neighborhood and what it was already taking. Victoria listened. She was a good listener when she chose to be, he'd give her that. She didn't interrupt and she didn't perform attentiveness. She was actually tracking, actually adjusting, which was a different thing. Claire took notes. Daniel looked at the floor and occasionally at his tablet and had the expression of someone managing internal calculations he wasn't sharing. At one point, Victoria said, "What would you have done in my position?" Honest answer. He thought about it. "I probably would have pushed the same way early on," he said. "The project has real value. The timeline pressure is real. The business case is real." He turned the socket wrench in his hand the same way he always did when he was thinking. But I would have had someone like Claire in the room before the second refusal, not after the fourth. She accepted that without arguing. It was the kind of observation that only works if the person hearing it can see themselves clearly enough to recognize it. By 6 o'clock, when the light through the garage's front windows had gone gold and then gray and Rosa had turned the work lights on, they had covered enough ground that there was something to build on. Not an agreement, an outline of what an agreement might eventually look like. Several properties that had been in the Meridian acquisition zone that were still in contract limbo. The question of what community use looked like inside a luxury development corridor. The specific practical question of what Ethan's 3 conditions would actually require from Sinclair Development in terms of legal process and financial structure. Nobody had the complete answers, but the questions were on the table, which was more than they'd managed before. Lily arrived at 6:15, let in by the front door she had a key to, with her backpack and her after-school energy and complete indifference to the collection of adults having what appeared to be a serious conversation in her father's garage. She went straight to the office, found the crackers, and began doing homework. Victoria watched her for a moment from across the room, this small, specific girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's way of occupying space without making noise. She looked back at Ethan. Something in her face had been rearranging itself slowly all afternoon, and she let him see the result of that rearrangement without trying to control what it communicated. "I owe this neighborhood something," she said quietly. "Not for the room. For him." He held her gaze. "Yeah," he said. "You do." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't resolution. It was 2 people in a garage at the end of a long day, sitting with the complicated truth that it was possible to be intelligent and driven and completely wrong about something that mattered, and that the only useful direction from that realization was forward. Claire gathered her notes. Daniel closed his tablet. They said their formal goodbyes. Victoria stood last. She looked at the garage one more time. Really looked at it, the way she hadn't let herself look the first time. Thursday was the right call, she said, not to anyone in particular. She walked out. Rosa waited until the SUV was gone from the window before she swiveled her chair to face Ethan. "The administrative review is withdrawn," she said, as if testing whether saying it out loud made it more real. "Yeah, that's—" She stopped. "Ethan, that's actually a big deal." "I know. So we won?" He was watching Lily through the office window, bent over her homework with the concentrated frown she got when the math was giving her trouble. "Not yet," he said. He picked up the socket wrench one more time and walked back toward the Civic. The Harmon Institute documents arrived Monday morning at 8:43, attached to an email from Priya Anand with a subject line that said simply, "As promised." 11 pages. Ethan read them at the desk in the front office with his coffee going cold beside him, the same way he read everything. From the beginning, without skipping, without assuming he already understood what the structure would be before he got to it. Rosa arrived at 9 and found him on page 7. She put her bag down and stood in the doorway and watched him read. She had learned not to ask questions when he was in this mode. The particular stillness he got when processing something important, his eyes moving steadily down the page, his right hand resting flat on the desk, fingers slightly spread, the way they did when he was deciding things. He finished. He set the pages down. He drank the cold coffee without appearing to notice it was cold. "Well?" Rosa said. "It's good." He squared the pages. "There's a clause in Section 4 about publication rights I want to modify. The rest is fine. You're going to negotiate with the Harmon Institute." "Minor modification," he said. "Not a negotiation. I just want the documentation right." He looked at her. "Can you call Priya Anand and tell her I'd like a short call this afternoon? One item, shouldn't take long." She picked up the phone. While she was dialing, he looked out the front window at the street. The morning was overcast, the sky the particular flat white of a day that couldn't decide whether to clear or not. A delivery truck was double parked across the street. 2 of the neighborhood kids were on bikes at the corner, going nowhere specific, in the way that kids go nowhere specific when school is out. He thought about Victoria's question from Thursday. "What would you have done in my position?" He'd given her the honest answer, but the fuller answer, the one he hadn't said, was that he understood ambition well enough to know it was not, by itself, a flaw. He had been ambitious once, in the ordered world of Callaway Dynamics, where ambition expressed itself through projects and patents and peer reviews. The ambition hadn't left. It had just changed shape. It lived now in the back room, patient and unfinished, waiting for 6 months that kept becoming complicated. The call with Priya took 12 minutes. She accepted the modification to Section 4 without argument, which told him she'd anticipated it. The documents would be revised and filed by Wednesday. He thanked her. Rosa was looking at her spreadsheet when he hung up. She had the expression she got when numbers were doing something she didn't like. "We need to talk about the formal negotiations," she said. "I know. Ethan, I'm serious. We're going to be in a room with Sinclair Development's legal team and their community relations director and probably a city liaison. We need someone on our side who does this professionally." Ray offered his lawyer. Ray's lawyer does automotive contracts. This is a property negotiation with community concessions embedded in it. It's different. She pulled up something on her screen. "There's a firm downtown, Reyes and Associates. They specialize in community land use. They did the Holbrook neighborhood case 2 years ago. Won a covenant agreement from a developer that preserved 6 commercial properties." He looked at her. "How do you know about them?" "Because I've been paying attention to what's coming while you've been managing what's already here." She said it without sharpness, matter of fact. "I reached out last week, informally, just to see if they'd take a call. And?" "The senior partner, Gabriela Reyes, read Jordan's article. She wants to meet." He was quiet for a moment. He felt the particular friction of someone who had been managing a situation alone for long enough that accepting help required a conscious adjustment. It wasn't pride exactly, more like the habit of self-sufficiency that forms when you've had to be the only reliable variable in a set of circumstances for a long time. "Set it up," he said. Rosa allowed herself a small, controlled expression of satisfaction and picked up her phone. Gabriela Reyes was 51, compact, With reading glasses she pushed on and off constantly in a way that seemed unconscious and efficient rather than nervous. She wore her silver-streaked hair pulled back and had the particular authority of someone whose competence had been tested enough times in enough rooms that she'd stopped needing to establish it when she walked in. She met Ethan at the garage on Wednesday afternoon, her choice of location, which he appreciated. She walked the main floor. She looked at the documentation wall that Rosa had assembled over the past weeks, printed copies of the inspection report, the correction records with date stamps, the Harmon Institute Partnership Agreement, the letter confirming the administrative review withdrawal, the legal correspondence from the 4 firms, all of it organized chronologically on the corkboard that had previously held Rosa's scheduling calendar. She studied it for a while. Then she turned. "You built a record," she said. "Yes." "Without a lawyer." At first, she looked at him steadily. "The Harmon Institute Partnership is smart. That's the load-bearing piece legally. Everything else is context." She took her glasses off and held them. "What are your 3 conditions? I've read the article. I want to hear you say them." He said them. He was precise about it. Not the general shape of the conditions, but the specific outcomes he needed. The properties. The legal framework he envisioned for returning them to community control. The public acknowledgement. He had been thinking about these for months, not in the abstract, but in the operational specifics. The way an engineer thinks about problems. Not what do I want, but what structure produces that result. Gabriella listened without writing anything. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "The 3 properties you're naming," she said. "The Okafor property, Kwan's building, and the community lot on Pryor Street. Sinclair has full ownership on all 3. There's no pending litigation. They're clean acquisitions, legally." "I know." "Returning them to community control requires them to agree to a transfer or a covenant. They don't have to." "I know," he said again. "That's why the negotiation has to happen before they break ground on the final corridor. Once construction starts, their legal position hardens and their public exposure decreases. Right now, they're still in a window where bad press is expensive." She put her glasses back on. "You've thought about the leverage points." "I've had time." "The public acknowledgement," she said. "That's the one that will get the most resistance. Companies don't like formal admissions. It opens civil liability doors." "I'm not looking for an admission that creates liability," he said. "I'm looking for a public statement, specific language, that longtime Riverton residents deserved a process that was more transparent and more respectful than the one they got." He paused. "The language matters. I'll want to see it before it goes out." She looked at him for a long moment. "You know what you're doing." "I know what I want," he said. "That's not always the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's a better starting position than most people bring me." She closed her notebook. "I'll take the case. My fee structure is on a sliding scale for community interest matters. Rosa has my email." After she left, Rosa said, "I like her." "She's good," Ethan said. "She didn't flatter you once. That's why she's good." The formal negotiation was scheduled for the following Thursday, at a conference room in a building neither party owned. Neutral ground, Gabriella's insistence. In the 10 days between Gabriella's garage visit and the meeting, several things moved. The Harmon Institute documents were filed with the city's development office on Wednesday, creating the formal record of research activity at the Mercer's auto site. Priya Anand sent a separate letter on Institute letterhead to the city's planning department, noting the Institute's interest in the continued operation of the affiliated research facility. It was a polite letter, professionally understated, and completely unmistakable in its intent to anyone who understood how institutional relationships functioned in city planning contexts. The national outlet that had called about development pressure tactics ran a different story instead. They had pivoted to a broader piece about community displacement in mid-sized American cities, in which Riverton was mentioned as a case study alongside 4 other cities. Ethan was quoted in 3 paragraphs. Victoria's name appeared once, attributed to public records. The story was fair and unflattering to no one individually, which was somehow more uncomfortable for Sinclair Development than a direct attack would have been. Jordan Macy published a follow-up piece about the Harmon Institute partnership. It was shorter than the original, 600 words, but it ran with a photograph she'd taken on her second visit. Ethan, at the work table in the back room, bent over the circuit diagrams, the prototype visible behind him in the soft, climate-controlled light. The photograph communicated something that the words around it couldn't quite say directly. That whatever was happening in this garage, it was real, and it was not finished, and it had not been stopped. The photograph was shared 4,300 times in the first 24 hours. Isabel Sinclair apparently sent it to 3 people from her school with the message, "My mom is trying to shut this down. It's actually kind of insane." This according to Rosa, who had discovered it through the circuitous route of a friend's teenager who went to St. Catherine's. Ethan filed this information under things he did not need to act on and moved forward. Ray called on the Tuesday before the negotiation. "The Swiss Museum," he said without preamble. "I know," Ethan said. "They've been patient, but they want an answer. They've got an exhibition space opening in the fall, and they want the green car for the inaugural show." "A loan agreement," Ethan said. "Not a sale. The car comes back." "They understand that. They've done it before. They have 6 vehicles on extended loan from private owners. The arrangement is clean." He thought about the dark green car sitting in the back room under its climate-controlled lighting. He thought about the barn in Kentucky where he'd found it, a collapsed outbuilding behind an abandoned farmhouse, the car half buried under a collapsed section of roof, 6 inches of accumulated debris on the hood. He had spent 14 months bringing it back to what it had been. He knew every seam of it. He thought about Kara, who had never been to Switzerland, who had wanted to go, who had a photograph of the Alps on the wall of their old apartment that she'd torn from a magazine when she was 23 and kept moving with them from place to place because she said it reminded her that there was still a lot of world she hadn't seen yet. "Okay," he said. Okay meaning call them, set up the loan agreement, send it to Gabriela Reyes for review before I sign anything." "Done." Ray paused. "You sure?" "It's not a sale," Ethan said. "It comes back." "It comes back," Ray confirmed. He sat with the phone for a moment after the call ended. He was sitting in the back room. He came in here sometimes in the evenings when the garage was closed, not always to work, sometimes just to think in the presence of the things that mattered most to him. The prototype sat at the far end. The rest of the collection was arranged the way it always was, each car in its place, the lighting set low. He thought about the calibration problem. Webb's idea about the sensor array had opened a door he'd been standing in front of for months, but walking through it required components he was still waiting on. A specific processor that had to be sourced through a specialty manufacturer in Portland who was running on a 10-week lead time. 10 weeks. After everything else, 10 weeks felt almost manageable. He thought about Lily, asleep at Mrs. Patterson's because it was late and he'd lost track of time again. He'd do better about that. He kept saying he'd do better about that. He thought about Kara, the way he thought about her in this room more than anywhere. Not with the acute grief of the first year, which had been like walking with something broken inside that moved when you moved, but with a quieter missing, more like a permanent shift in the shape of things. She would have had thoughts about all of this. Sharp, structural thoughts, delivered without ceremony. She would have liked Gabriela Reyes. She would have been exasperated by Ray in a fond way. She would have had complicated feelings about Victoria Sinclair that she would have worked through out loud at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night while Ethan made tea and listened. He missed her in the specific way that you miss someone who was better at certain things than you were, and who is therefore missed not just as a person, but as a capability, an entire way of seeing that left with them. He turned off the light and went home. The negotiation happened on a gray Thursday morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown. The table was long, and the chairs were the kind that adjusted too many ways. Coffee had been set out by someone and was already lukewarm by the time everyone settled. Gabriela sat beside Ethan. Across the table, Sandra Park, Sinclair Development's general counsel, Claire Nguyen, a property attorney named Howard Fells, who had the practiced blankness of someone who had been in many rooms like this, and Victoria Sinclair. No Daniel today. His absence was a choice, Ethan thought. Victoria positioning herself as the decision-maker in the room, removing the buffer, which was either confidence or vulnerability, and possibly both. Sandra Park opened. She was precise and professional and laid out Sinclair Development's current position clearly. They remained committed to the Meridian development, the construction timeline was firm, and they were present today in a spirit of good faith to discuss resolution. Gabriella acknowledged that and laid out Ethan's position with equal clarity. The garage was not for sale, the research partnership was established and operational, and the discussion today was not about the building but about the neighborhood. Sandra looked at Victoria. Victoria nodded once. Proceed. The 3 properties, Gabriella said, and named them. Howard Fells made a note. Sandra said, "We're prepared to discuss a community covenant structure on 2 of the 3. The Prior Street lot presents complications." "What complications?" Gabriella asked. "It's been designated in the development plan as green space. It's already in the architectural drawings." Ethan spoke for the first time. "Then put the green space there. That's not the issue. The issue is who controls what happens to it. A community covenant means the neighborhood has a seat at the table on decisions about that space going forward. That's different from ownership." Howard Fells started to say something, and Victoria said quietly, "Howard." He stopped. She looked at Ethan. "Walk me through what the covenant would look like practically." He did. He'd worked through it with Gabriella. A formal community advisory role in decisions about the Prior Street space, with binding consultation requirements for any changes to its use. Not veto power, consultation with teeth. Victoria looked at Sandra. "Is that structurally workable?" "It adds a layer," Sandra said carefully. "I asked if it's workable." "With appropriate legal drafting, yes." "Then draft it." Victoria turned back. "The Okafor property," Gabriella said, "direct transfer. Return to the Okafor family at no cost." Howard said, "That's not commercially." "Howard," Victoria said again. Then to Gabriella, "Ruth Okafor signed a purchase agreement. We paid fair market." "You paid in a context where her alternatives had been narrowed," Gabriella said. Not aggressively, flatly, stating a position. Victoria looked at the table for a moment. She turned her coffee cup a quarter turn. "If we offer the property back at the original purchase price, she can buy it back for what we paid. Is that the structure?" Gabriella glanced at Ethan. He gave the smallest nod. "That would satisfy the condition on the Okafor property," Gabriella said. "We'd need Ruth Okafor to agree," Victoria said. "I've spoken with her," Ethan said. "She'll agree." Something moved in Victoria's face. Not surprise, exactly, but the adjustment of someone who keeps discovering that Ethan had already covered the ground she thought she was walking into first. "You spoke to her?" "Last week," he said. "She's been renting the house back from the holding company your acquisition subsidiary put it under. She wants to come home." A silence settled over the table. Not uncomfortable, more like the silence of a room in which something real has just been said and everyone is letting it land before moving on. Sandra spoke carefully. "We'd have to route the transfer through the subsidiary. It's technically a sale, just at a specific price. There are tax implications." "That's your problem," Gabriella said pleasantly. Sandra looked at Victoria. Victoria said, "Work it out." Kwan's building was harder. The tile shop had been emptied and the space was already part of the construction footprint. The building itself had been stripped internally. Dennis Kwan didn't want the building back. He'd moved his operation to another neighborhood and was rebuilding there. What he wanted, and what Ethan had spoken to him about, was something different. A formal acknowledgement that the pressure on his silent partner had been deliberate, and compensation for the commercial losses he'd sustained in the period when the violations were being leveraged. This was the part that Sandra Park's jaw got tight about. "We're not in a position to admit liability for—" "Nobody's asking for a liability admission," Gabriella said. "We're asking for a settlement payment described as a goodwill gesture in support of small business continuity in the Riverton Development Zone. You've done similar things on other projects. I pulled 3 examples." She slid a document across the table. Sandra picked it up. Howard looked at it over her shoulder. Victoria watched. "The amount?" Sandra asked. Gabriella said a number. Howard made a sound that was almost but not quite a response. "It's within the range of what you've paid in similar contexts," Gabriella said calmly, "and significantly less than what a civil action would cost you in legal fees alone, assuming the documentation trail on the violations became part of the discovery." The word discovery did the work it was supposed to do. Sandra put the document down. "We'd need to discuss internally. Of course, Gabriella said. We'll take a break. During the break, Ethan and Gabriella stood in the hallway outside the conference room with cups of coffee that were better than the ones inside. Rosa had texted him twice, once to ask how it was going, and once to say that the Portland processor manufacturer had moved their delivery estimate up to 6 weeks. He stared at the second message for a moment. 6 weeks. He put his phone away. The Quan settlement is going to take another session, Gabriella said. They'll agree. The number is right. But they need to feel like they had a negotiation, not a corner. Fine, he said. The public acknowledgement is next, she said. That's going to be the longest part. I know. She looked at him. You're not in a hurry. I've been in a hurry for 2 years, he said. It hasn't helped. She sipped her coffee. Your conditions are going to hold. I want you to know that. Sandra Park is smart and Howard Fells is thorough, but they're operating in a context that has already shifted against them. The documentation, the institute, the press coverage. You built a structure before you walked into this room. That matters. I know it matters, he said. I'm still going to feel better when it's signed. Spoken like an engineer, she said. When they went back in, Victoria had rearranged herself slightly in her chair. A small physical shift that Ethan read as someone who had used the break to make a decision and was now settled into it. The Quan settlement, she said before Sandra could speak. We'll do it. Not at the number Gabriella named, but I'll authorize Sandra to get within 10%. She looked at Ethan. I want the details of the documentation trail, the violations leverage, to stay out of any public statement around the settlement. Ethan looked at Gabriella. She gave a small, precise nod. This was acceptable. This had been anticipated. Agreed, Ethan said. Victoria inhaled. The public acknowledgement. She had a paper in front of her, a printed draft he could see, though not what it said. My communications team drafted language. I want you to read it before we discuss it. Sandra slid the paper across to Gabriella, who read it and passed it to Ethan. The language was careful, professionally drafted. It acknowledged that Sinclair Development had moved quickly through the Riverton acquisition process and that some residents had experienced the process as impersonal and insufficient. It expressed the company's commitment to a more collaborative approach in the second phase of the development. It said the company valued the character and history of Riverton. It did not say anything about the inspection tactics. It did not say anything about pressure applied to holdouts. It was not dishonest. But it was incomplete in the specific way that statements become incomplete when the people drafting them are trying to acknowledge something without naming it. Ethan put it down. This isn't what I asked for, he said. Victoria met his eyes. Tell me what you want changed. The part about residents experiencing the process as impersonal, he said. I want it to say that residents deserved a process that was more transparent and that mistakes were made that affected people's choices. Not some residents experienced. That puts it on how people felt. I want it to acknowledge that things happened that shouldn't have. He paused. Not in legal language. In plain English. Sandra started to speak. Victoria put her hand flat on the table, not sharply, just a clear signal to wait. She looked at Ethan for a long time. He held it. He wasn't going to move on this. He had thought about it for long enough, in enough late evenings in the garage and at the kitchen table after Lily went to bed, to be certain of it. The language was the thing. The language was what made it real instead of managed. If we include that language, Victoria said, it will be reported. Yes, he said. It will look like an admission. It will look like an honest statement, he said, which is different. She looked at Sandra. Sandra's face said, I advise against this. Her face said it clearly, professionally, without words, in the language of counsel to client that exists entirely in expression and posture. Victoria looked back at Ethan. Give me your language, she said. What you'd want it to say. Exactly. He had written it. Of course he had. He reached into the folder in front of him and slid a single page across the table. She read it. It was short. 4 sentences. He had spent a week on 4 sentences, the way you spend a week on things that have to carry weight. She read it twice. She set it down. She didn't look at Sandra. She didn't look at Howard. She looked at Ethan and said, All right. The room was quiet for a moment. Sandra said, "Victoria?" I said, "All right, Sandra." Her voice was calm, decided. "We'll use his language. With minor grammatical review, nothing substantive." She looked at Ethan. "I want one addition, one sentence at the end, about the future of the development." Gabriella said, "We'd review the addition." "Of course." Victoria picked up her pen and wrote on the draft. She slid it back to Gabriella, who read it and passed it to Ethan. The added sentence said, "Sinclair Development commits to a community oversight board for the Riverton Meridian Project's second phase, with authority to review decisions affecting neighborhood character and commercial continuity." He read it twice. He hadn't asked for this. It was beyond what he'd asked for. It was the kind of thing that, if it held, if it was actually implemented and not just printed, would mean something for the neighborhood in the years after the construction was done. He looked at her. "That's real?" he said. "I don't do things I don't intend to do," she said. It was neither defensive nor proud, just a statement about herself, with the particular weight of a person who has been examining themselves recently and is trying to be accurate. He looked at Gabriella. She was reading the sentence again, and her expression had the controlled quality of someone who is more pleased than they want to show in a negotiating room. "We'd need the oversight board defined in a separate agreement," Gabriella said. "Membership structure, authority parameters, dispute resolution." "We'll draft it," Sandra said, with the energy of someone who is unhappy with the direction of a meeting but is professional enough to redirect toward implementation. "Second session? Next week." "Next week?" Victoria agreed. She looked at Ethan. "Is there anything else for today?" He thought about it. About the two conditions they'd substantially agreed to, and the third that was in motion. About the sentences on the page in front of him, 4 of his and 1 of hers. "No," he said. "That's enough for today." The meeting broke at 12:40. In the elevator down, Gabriella stood beside him and said nothing until they reached the lobby. Then she said, "The oversight board was not on my list." "No," he said. "She offered that herself." "Yeah." They walked out into the overcast day, the street traffic moving past them. Gabriella put her reading glasses in her bag. "How do you feel?" she asked. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about most things. He felt the particular exhausted clarity of a person who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just set it down in a specific place rather than dropping it. Not relief. Not yet. The agreements had to be drafted. The documents had to be signed. The oversight board had to be structured and filled and made real. Ruth Okafor had to actually get her house back. There was still a lot between here and done, but the conditions were on the table and they were holding. The garage was still standing. The prototype was still waiting, 6 weeks closer now to the processor that would let him solve the last problem. And Lily had a science project due Friday that he still needed to help her with. "Tired," he said. Gabriella nodded. "Good kind or bad kind?" He looked at the street, at the overcast sky, at the city going past on a Thursday afternoon with complete indifference to everything that had just happened in a room 14 floors up. "I'm not sure yet," he said. "Ask me when it's signed." She flagged a cab. He walked back to the parking garage where he'd left his truck, his hands in his pockets, the 4 sentences in the folder under his arm, the weight of the whole thing settling into the specific shape of something that had moved. Back at Mercer's Auto, Rosa looked up from her desk when he came in. He put the folder on the desk. She opened it. She read. She looked up. "The oversight board," she said. Her idea. But Rosa set the folder down slowly. She looked at the wall of documentation behind her, the timeline they'd built, the letters, the forms, the records of every push and every response. All of it. Months of it. "You know what this means," she said, "if it holds." "I know. This neighborhood is going to change regardless, but the people here would have a seat at the table for how it changes." She paused. "That's actually—" "Yeah," he said. He sat down in the chair across from her desk. He stretched his legs out. He looked at the ceiling. He thought, Kara would have had something to say about this. He thought, she would have been right. He sat in his garage with its worn floor and its rattling fan and its steel door and its secret room and its 7 violations now reduced to 2, and he let himself feel the weight of what was still ahead and the strange, incomplete satisfaction of what had moved today. It wasn't over, but it had shifted. And sometimes that was how things changed. Not all at once, not cleanly, not the way it looked in the telling, but in rooms on 14 floors up on gray Thursday mornings, 4 sentences at a time. The signing happened on a Tuesday in late October, 6 weeks after the negotiation session, in the same conference room on the 14th floor. The sky outside was clear for the first time in what felt like weeks, the particular hard blue of a fall morning that has finally decided to be cold and committed to it. Ethan noticed it through the window when he arrived and thought it was the kind of detail Kara would have mentioned, the way she always noticed weather as though it was trying to tell you something. Gabriella was already there when he arrived, her glasses on, reviewing the final documents with the focused attention she brought to everything. There was a stack of papers in front of each chair. Coffee again. And this time someone had thought to bring it in a thermal carafe so it would actually still be warm when people needed it. Rosa had wanted to come. He had said yes, and then she had said she had 3 service appointments that couldn't be moved, and looked at him in a way that communicated she was choosing to stay at the garage because someone needed to hold that ground while he was here. He understood. He'd told her he'd call her the moment the ink was dry. Sandra Park arrived with Howard Fells and a junior associate who carried the additional copies. Claire Nguyen came in behind them, with a folder of her own. Victoria arrived last, 2 minutes before the scheduled time, wearing a gray coat she hadn't taken off yet, her hair slightly windblown from whatever the morning had done to it on the way in from the parking structure. She sat down without ceremony and poured herself coffee. The signing itself took 40 minutes, which was mostly the logistics of multiple agreements requiring initials on multiple pages in multiple places. Sandra narrated each section as they moved through it. Gabriella confirmed each one. Ethan signed steadily, reading each page before he initialed it, which he'd done every time he'd signed anything in his life, and which he wasn't going to stop doing because he was tired or because the room expected efficiency. The community covenant on Pryor Street. The Okafor property transfer at original purchase price, with a letter to Ruth Okafor that Claire had drafted and Ethan had reviewed and found honest. The Kwan settlement, described as a goodwill contribution to small business continuity in the Riverton Development Zone, the number within 9% of what Gabriella had asked for. The public acknowledgement statement, 4 sentences of Ethan's and 1 of Victoria's, formatted on Sinclair Development letterhead, scheduled for release at noon today. And last, the Community Oversight Board Agreement, 12 pages, which defined the board's membership, authority, and dispute resolution process in the specific structural language that made things real rather than aspirational. When the final page was signed, Sandra gathered her copies with the practiced efficiency of someone who does this regularly and finds ritual in the practicality of it. Howard Fells capped his pen. The junior associate stacked documents. Gabriella looked at Ethan. He looked at the signed pages in front of him. He thought about something. Not a big thought, just a specific one. That he had sat at the desk in the front office of the garage with a cup of cold coffee and a stack of threatening letters on a night when the whole thing had seemed like it was built on the wrong side of a very large financial and legal machine. And he had thought clearly about what he needed and what he was willing to do to get it. And the thing he'd thought about had, more or less, happened. Not perfectly. Nothing had gone perfectly. He'd spent money he hadn't planned to spend and lost sleep he hadn't had to lose. The drainage fix had gone over quote. Ray had fronted things that Ethan was still working through how to repay. The 4 law firms had cost him 2 weeks of focused worry and 1 genuinely bad night where he'd sat in the back room at midnight and seriously wondered, for the first time, whether he was wrong about all of it. He hadn't been wrong, but the wondering had been real. Victoria set her pen down. She looked across the table at him, and for a moment the room's business fell away, and it was just 2 people looking at each other across a distance that had been measured in months and money and a very large amount of stubbornness. Done, she said. Done, he said. She didn't smile, and neither did he, which felt right. This wasn't the kind of thing that resolved into a smile. It resolved into a fact a set of signed documents that would go into filing systems and generate action items and eventually produce real changes in real places. The smile was beside the point. "The statement goes out at noon," she said. "I know. My communications director is very unhappy with me." "I know that too," he said. Something shifted at the corners of her eyes. Not quite a smile either, but something in that neighborhood. "I assume you've been following the coverage." "Rosa follows it. She tells me what I need to know." Victoria looked at her coffee. "The national piece, the one about development pressure tactics." She paused. "That's going to follow this company for a while." "Probably," he said without apology. "I know." She turned the cup once. "I want you to know that the oversight board is going to be real, not a quarterly checkbox meeting, an actual board with actual authority." She looked at him directly. "I've put Claire in charge of building it, and I've told her she can recruit people who will push back, not decorative community representatives, people who will actually argue." He held her gaze. "I'd like to suggest 2 names for the initial membership." "Send them to Claire." "I will." Gabriella was packing her bag. She caught Ethan's eye and gave him the brief contained nod of a person who has won something and is professional enough not to let it show too much in front of the other party. He returned it. Howard Fells and the junior associate left first. Sandra said a few words to Gabriella about the filing timeline and then left. Claire told Ethan she would call him this week about the Okafor transfer paperwork, and then said quietly, and apart from the professional context, "I'm glad this happened the way it did." He said thank you and meant it. Then there was just Ethan and Victoria and Gabriella and the table of signed documents and the clear blue sky through the window. Victoria stood. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She paused. "The prototype," she said. He waited. "I know you're close." She said it carefully. "When it's ready, if you ever do a public demonstration or if the Institute publishes, I'd like to know. Not for business reasons." She seemed to be finding the right words, which was a slightly unusual quality in a person who was generally very quick with words. "I want to know how it turns out." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll send you the Harmon Institute paper when it comes out." She nodded once. "That would be good." She moved toward the door, then stopped again with her hand on the doorframe. The gesture of someone with one more thing that has been sitting at the edge of the conversation and needs to be said before the door closes. "He asked about you," she said. "Isabel. She asked if I thought you'd finish it." "What did you tell her?" Victoria looked at him steadily. "I told her yes." She left. Gabriella waited until the elevator sound had faded and then said briskly and without sentimentality, "Call your staff, file your copy, and get some sleep." She shook his hand. "It was good work, Ethan." He thanked her. He meant that too. He stood alone in the conference room for a moment before he picked up his folder. He looked at the city through the window, the hard blue sky, the buildings catching the morning light, the streets below where people moved with the perpetual forward momentum of a city that does not pause to notice the things that happen in its rooms 14 floors up. He thought, it's done. Not triumphantly. Just as a fact, the way facts settle when they're finally true. He called Rosa from the elevator. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been sitting with the phone. "Done?" she said. "Done," he said. A short silence. He could hear the garage in the background, the specific ambient sound of the place, the ventilation fan and the distant radio, and the sounds of the neighborhood through the open roll-up door. "How do you feel?" she asked. The same question Gabriella had asked him 6 weeks ago, coming out of the negotiation. "Better than 6 weeks ago," he said. "That's something." "It's enough for now," he said. The statement went out at noon, as scheduled. Ethan read it on his phone sitting in the truck in the parking garage before he drove back to Riverton. He read all 4 sentences and then the 5th, Victoria's addition about the oversight board, and then he put his phone in his pocket and sat for a moment in the concrete quiet of the parking structure. He thought about Dennis Kwan, who had been rebuilding his tile shop in a different neighborhood and who had called last week to say he'd heard something might be happening and Ethan had said it's happening, and Dennis had been quiet for a moment and then said, all right, in the particular voice of someone who had already moved forward, but was relieved to know the record had been corrected. He thought about Ruth Okafor, who was 63 years old and whose mother had been born in a house that she had signed away on a day when her alternatives had been quietly narrowed. She was going to get the key back. She would probably cry, and then she would probably start arguing with the contractor she'd hired in her head about what needed fixing first, because she was that kind of person. He drove back to Riverton. The day the Harmon Institute letter to the city's planning department became public record, which happened 2 days after the signing, when a city council member with an interest in development policy pulled it in a routine records request and then mentioned it to a reporter, Jordan Macy called. "I hear you won," she said. "It's not a sports game," he said. "I know. But did you?" He thought about it. "The conditions are in writing. The oversight board is being formed. Ruth Okafor gets her house back." He paused. "Yeah. It went the way it needed to go. Can I come by? I want to write a follow-up." "When?" "Whenever works." "Friday afternoon," he said. "Bring a better camera this time. The one you used last time didn't do the lighting right." She laughed. He hadn't been joking, but that was fine. She came Friday. She was better prepared this time. She'd done more research in the intervening months and came with questions that were more specific, more technical, more interested in the engineering and less in the dramatic narrative frame. He appreciated that. They spent an hour in the back room and he told her things he hadn't told her the first time. About the calibration problem, about Webb's sensor array idea, about the 6-week processor timeline that was now down to 2 weeks. 2 weeks. "And then?" she asked. "And then I test the feedback system," he said, "and either it works or it tells me what I got wrong." "What if it tells you what you got wrong?" He looked at the prototype, at the 4 years of evenings and weekends and late nights and small discoveries and significant failures that were embedded in the thing, invisible in its surface but present in every component's placement. "Then I figure out what's wrong," he said. "That's how it works." She wrote that down. The processor arrived on a Wednesday, 3 days ahead of the revised timeline, in a plain brown box that the delivery driver left at the front of the garage with a signature requirement that Rosa handled. She put the box on Ethan's workbench with the kind of care she applied to things that had been waited for. He opened it that evening after Lily was in bed at Mrs. Patterson's. Alone in the back room, in the climate-controlled quiet, he opened the box and looked at the component inside. It was not an impressive-looking thing. A flat, dense circuit assembly about the size of a paperback book wrapped in static protective material. It had a part number and a manufacturer's seal, and it looked exactly like the thing it was. A piece of sophisticated electronics that had taken 10 weeks and 3 supplier conversations to produce correctly. He held it for a moment. He set it down carefully on the work table. He went home and slept 8 hours, which was the first time in approximately 4 months he'd managed 8 continuous hours. And he woke up the next morning feeling the specific unfamiliar quality of a person who has rested properly and isn't entirely sure what to do with that. He did what he'd been doing for 4 years. He went to the garage. The installation process took 11 days, not because it was slow, but because it was precise, and because he'd learned that the cost of moving fast on a precision installation was a particular kind of expensive that could only be paid in lost time. Marcus Webb came on the 4th day, and they worked side by side for 6 hours on the integration of the sensor array, not as a supervisor and a subject, but as 2 engineers who had found the specific working rhythm that produces things that are better than either person would have made alone. Webb had a habit of narrating his reasoning out loud while he worked, which Ethan found initially odd and then useful, because it produced the same effect as talking to Kara had produced, making his own thinking more visible to himself by giving it something to push against. On the 11th day, Ethan sat alone in the back room at 8 o'clock in the evening and ran the first full diagnostic on the completed feedback system. The numbers came back clean, not perfect. There was a variance in one sensor array that was within tolerance, but at the high end of it, and he noted it and put it on the checklist for the next pass. But the calibration held. The energy recapture loop closed correctly. The computational architecture ran the way it was supposed to run, which was the way he had designed it to run, which was the way he had known it could run years ago in the evenings of a different life when he was drawing it out on paper at a kitchen table while Kara brought him coffee. He sat with it for a long time. He didn't jump up. He didn't call anyone. He sat in the quiet room with the numbers on the screen and the prototype in front of him, and he let it be real at whatever pace it needed to be real. He thought about the first time he'd written down the core principle, the energy recapture geometry, the specific insight that had made all of it possible. He had been on a flight back from a client meeting, somewhere over Ohio, and he'd written it on the back of a boarding pass because that was what was available. And he'd stared at it for the rest of the flight with the specific feeling of someone who has just seen something true and isn't yet sure what it's going to cost them. It had cost him. In time and money and sleep, and the specific wear of carrying something heavy for a long time without being able to set it down. It had cost him in the harder currency, too. The nights when Lily asked why he was going back to the garage again after dinner, and he said, "I have something to finish, Bug," and she accepted it with the particular patience of a child who understands that there are things in her parents' life she isn't entirely inside yet. He would do better about dinner. He would actually do better now that this specific weight had shifted. He stood. He checked the climate control. He turned off the diagnostic screen. He stood in front of the prototype one more time, the thing he had been building for 4 years, on the other side of the worst time of his life, in a garage in a neighborhood that had very nearly been erased. He put his hand on the hood, not ceremonially, just the way you touch something real when you need to confirm it's there. Then he locked the door behind him and called Marcus Webb. Webb picked up on the third ring. There was noise in the background. He was somewhere social. "Ethan?" "The diagnostic ran clean," Ethan said. A silence. The background noise faded, which meant Webb had moved away from wherever he was. "The full system?" Webb said. "Full system. Calibration held. There's one sensor variance I'm noting, but it's within tolerance." Another silence. Then Webb said, "When can I come?" "Monday," Ethan said. "We'll run it again with you here. I want an independent set of eyes on the data before we report to the Institute. I'll be there at 9. A pause. "Ethan, this is—" "I know," he said. "Do you understand what this means for the—" "I know," he said again, not impatiently. Just with the specific quality of someone who has lived with an idea long enough that they don't need it explained to them at the moment it becomes real. Monday at 9. He walked home under the October sky, his hands in his pockets. The neighborhood was quiet at this hour. A few lights in windows, a car moving slowly down Pryor Street, the distant sound of something mechanical from the direction of the main road. In a few months, the first phase of the Meridian development would be visible from here, the glass of new towers catching the afternoon light from the north end of the district. He'd seen the updated plans. The green space on Pryor Street was in them, correctly positioned, with a notation about community advisory oversight that was the direct result of 12 pages of signed agreement. The neighborhood was going to change. He had known that from the beginning, had never been under the illusion that one man in one garage could stop what $2 billion set in motion. That had never been the point. The point was how it changed, and who had a voice in it, and whether the people who had been here were treated like an inconvenience, or like people whose lives and histories were part of what the place actually was. He turned onto his street. Ruth Okafor had called him the week after the signing. She had done the thing he'd predicted, cried briefly, and then pivoted immediately to the practical, asking about the transfer timeline and whether the holding company had maintained the furnace properly. He told her what he knew about the timeline and said he didn't know about the furnace. She'd said she was going to have someone look at it before she signed anything. He'd said that was smart. She'd paused before she hung up. "Thank you," she said. He'd said, "You would have found your way back, it just would have taken longer." She'd made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been disagreement. "I'm 63, she'd said. "Longer matters at 63. He unlocked his front door. The house was the way it was at the end of a day when Lily had been at Mrs. Patterson's, slightly too quiet, her shoes absent from the entry mat, her backpack not blocking the hallway in the specific way it blocked the hallway when she was home. He was used to the quiet. He had made a version of himself that could live in it without falling into it. He made tea. He sat at the kitchen table. On the table was Lily's science project, finished last Friday with his help on the structural diagram, a model of a suspension bridge built from materials she had selected herself with the specific eclectic logic of a 7-year-old. Popsicle sticks for the deck, dental floss for the cables, 2 stacks of books as the towers. It had taken 3 hours, and there was still a residue of glue on the table that he hadn't fully cleaned off. The bridge was slightly crooked. The teacher had given her a B+ and written great understanding of tension forces on the rubric, which had made Lily so pleased she'd carried the rubric in her pocket for 3 days. He looked at the bridge. He thought about what he would tell her, eventually, when she was old enough to understand the full shape of the last 2 years. Not the dramatic version, not the version where her father heroically resisted a corporate machine through sheer moral force. The real version, which was more complicated and more interesting, that he had gotten lucky in some ways and been smart in others, and that people had helped him, Rosa and Ray and Jordan and Gabriella and Marcus Webb, and that the outcome had depended on all of those things being true at the same time. That a lot of people in similar situations didn't have a Marcus Webb, or a Gabriela Reyes, or a collection of rare cars that happened to catch the attention of a journalist on exactly the right week. He had not simply won because he was right. He had won because he was right, and he had built the right structure, and he had done it in a context where the particular combination of factors happened to break his way. That mattered. The distinction between deserving an outcome and achieving it was real, and confusing them was the kind of mistake that made people into worse versions of themselves. He would tell Lily that. Not yet, but eventually. He thought about Victoria. He thought about her in the way that you think about someone who has been, in sequence, an adversary and a complication, and finally, something that didn't have a clean category, a person who had done wrong things for reasons that weren't entirely wrong, who had looked at herself with more honesty than most people manage under pressure, and who had added a 5th sentence to a statement she hadn't had to improve. He had sent the names for the oversight board to Claire Nguyen the morning after the signing. Both were Riverton residents. A woman named Patricia Solis, who ran the neighborhood association and had been fighting city council on the pothole issue for 9 years, and had the particular energy of someone who fights because they're good at it, not because they expect to win. And an older man named George Tillman, who had owned a print shop 2 blocks from the garage for 30 years, and whose opinion on the character of the neighborhood was the kind of thing that took decades to earn. Claire had called back the same day to say both had been approached and both had agreed. Good, he had thought. They'll push back. That was the point. The oversight board had its first formal meeting scheduled for November. He would not be on it. He had been asked by Claire, and he had said no. His presence would make it about him, and it needed to be about the neighborhood. His role had been to make the board exist. Other people's job was to fill it with the right work. He finished his tea. He washed the cup. He stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard in the October dark. The small, neglected lawn he kept meaning to reseed. The fence that needed a board replaced on the east side. The oak tree that Lily had decided last spring was haunted and now had a full set of lore about it that she updated occasionally with new information. He thought about Kara one more time. One more specific time. He thought about what she had said, the last clear conversation they'd had, when she was still herself enough to have it, lying in the hospital bed with the particular directness she'd always had, stripped down to only what mattered by the narrowing of everything. Don't build a shrine, Ethan. That's not the same as remembering. Just keep going and take me with you. He had tried. Some days better than others. Some days the garage felt like a shrine, no matter what he told himself. Some days Lily looked at him with her mother's eyes from across the dinner table, and he had to work to stay present rather than falling into the loss of what the eyes reminded him of. But he had kept going. He had taken her with him. She was in every decision he'd made in that building, not in a sentimental way, but in the structural way, the way a foundation is present in everything built on it, without being visible in the finished surface. The prototype was finished. The garage was standing. Ruth Okafor was going home. The neighborhood had a voice in what happened next, and Lily's slightly crooked suspension bridge sat on the kitchen table, dental floss cables holding the popsicle stick deck in a configuration that understood tension forces even if it couldn't quite get the geometry straight, and that was enough. That was exactly the right kind of enough. He went to bed. The Harman Institute published its preliminary research paper 4 months later, in February, in one of the Institute's quarterly research bulletins that generally circulated within academic and engineering industry circles, and was read by approximately 4,000 people who cared about such things. The paper was credited to Ethan Mercer in collaboration with Dr. Marcus Webb and two of the Institute's engineering staff. It described, in the specific dense language of technical research, the architecture and operating principles of the propulsion and energy management system that had been developed at the Riverton facility. It did not use superlatives. It did not make claims about the future of the automotive industry. It described what had been built and how it worked and what the data showed. Within 48 hours, 3 major automotive engineering publications had summarized it in language that was considerably less restrained. Ray called. "Your phone is about to get very busy," he said. "I know," Ethan said. "I mean, people with money. Big money." "I know, Ray. You're going to need a different kind of representation than Gabriela Reyes." "I know that too," he said. "I've already been talking to someone." Ray paused. "You have?" "Webb knows people," he said. "I've been having conversations for 6 weeks." Another pause. "You never tell me anything until it's already done," Ray said, with the specific exasperation of a man who has been in Ethan's orbit long enough to know this was simply true. "It wasn't done yet," Ethan said. "And now?" "Now it's done enough to talk about." He didn't tell Ray the details because the details were still being worked out in conversations that would take another 2 months. What he would tell him eventually was that the outcome had involved a licensing arrangement, not a sale, not a buyout, not Ethan disappearing into the structure of a large company with his name on a patent and his control transferred to a boardroom. A licensing arrangement, with the Institute as the formal intellectual property holder, that would allow a manufacturing partner to develop the technology while Ethan maintained a specific ongoing role in its application. He had learned from the garage. You could take a fair offer, but you had to know what you were actually protecting before you decided what you'd accept. Jordan's final piece on the garage ran in March, the same week the licensing agreement was announced. She had known it was coming. He'd given her a week's advance notice, because she'd been with the story from the beginning, and that meant something. The piece was longer than her previous ones, and better, he thought, though he was not an objective reader. It covered the development fight, and the research paper and the licensing deal, and at the end spent 3 paragraphs on something she hadn't covered in the earlier pieces. Kara. Not in a maudlin way. In the factual way that Jordan did things, who she was, what she did, how she had thought the garage was a good idea before there was any evidence that it was. He had told her those things himself. He had sat in the front office on a Tuesday afternoon with Rosa conspicuously absent and told Jordan about Kara with the same plain directness he brought to mechanical explanations, because he had decided the story was incomplete without it, and incomplete was its own kind of dishonest. Jordan had said, "Are you sure you want this in?" "Yes," he said. "People will make it sentimental." "Some people make everything sentimental," he said. "That doesn't mean you leave it out." The piece ran under a headline he hadn't seen in advance: What Mercer's Auto Was Always Building. He read it at the desk in the front office with Rosa across from him, making a show of doing invoices and not reading over his shoulder, which she absolutely was. When he finished, he put his phone down. Rosa said, without looking up, "Good?" "Yeah," he said. "Good." Spring came to Riverton the way it always came, suddenly and incompletely, a warm week followed by a cold week, followed by 2 warm weeks that finally stuck. The construction on the northern end of the Meridian project had been going since January, the sounds of it audible from the garage on still mornings, the specific deep percussion of heavy machinery working at scale. From the second floor of the building across the street, you could already see the steel framing of what would eventually be the first tower, rising against the sky. The garage sat where it had always sat: faded walls, rusted roof edge, oil-stained apron. The sign above the roll-up door was still mostly bleached to nothing. Ethan had considered repainting it and then decided not to, for reasons he didn't entirely examine. Rosa had hired a second mechanic in February, a young man named Antoine who was 24 and very good with electrical systems, and had found out about the job through the automotive blog coverage and applied with a letter that was 3 sentences long and entirely about his qualifications and 0 sentences about how much he admired what Ethan had done, which was the reason Ethan had called him back. Business was steady, not transformed. The neighborhood's foot traffic was still what it was, and most of the clients were still the same people with the same cars that needed the same kinds of attention. But there were new clients now, people from other parts of the city who came because they'd read the articles or heard the name. Some of them left when they discovered the garage was not a showroom. The ones who stayed were the ones who cared about the work. On a Saturday in April, Ethan was under a truck, a 2005 F-150 with a persistent coolant leak that the owner had been living with for 2 years, when he heard the front door. He rolled out. Victoria Sinclair was standing in the middle of the garage. Alone this time, no SUV visible through the front window, which meant she'd either parked around the corner or come another way. She was wearing a coat, not the fitted executive jacket of her previous visits, but something more ordinary. Her hair was slightly windblown again. "I should have called," she said. "Probably," he agreed. He sat up on the creeper, arms on his knees. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, and then seemed to hear how that sounded because she added, "Actually, I was at the Pryor Street site, the community meeting, first one under the new board." He hadn't known about the meeting, which meant Patricia Solis had run it without thinking she needed to loop in Ethan, which was exactly right. How'd it go? Patricia Solis told my site manager that his preliminary green space plan looked like it was designed by someone who had never actually sat in a park, Victoria said. In those words, he felt something that was close to satisfaction. That sounds about right. My site manager is going to hate this board, she said. Good. She almost smiled. It was closer than before. There had been a series of things that had gotten them incrementally closer to a register of conversation that had actual warmth in it, not just mutual respect and managed conflict. Warmth was different. Warmth took time. The Okafor property transferred last week, she said. I thought you'd want to know. Ruth has the key. She called me, he said. The furnace is fine, apparently. Thank God for small mercies, Victoria said, in the way of someone who doesn't mean it religiously, but has the phrase in their vocabulary from somewhere. She looked around the garage. She looked at the steel door in the back. Is it different? She said. In there. Now that it's done? Yes. He thought about it honestly, the way he tried to think about everything. It's quieter, he said. It was loud in there for a long time. Not literally, but... He paused. It was a problem. Now it's a solution. Those are different kinds of rooms. She nodded slowly. What do you do in there now? There's a new problem, he said. She looked at him. There's always a new problem, he said. Not with exhaustion, with something that was closer to the thing that had kept him going through the whole 2 years. The specific animal appetite for a hard problem, which was maybe the thing he recognized most clearly in himself and which Kara had called, affectionately and accurately, his most reliable quality. You're going to be fine, she had told him once, because you can't leave a problem alone. It's annoying sometimes, but it'll keep you moving. She had been right, the way she was usually right. Victoria looked at him for a moment, this man in a work shirt with grease on his forearms sitting on a creeper in the middle of his garage, which was the same building it had always been and was worth something entirely different from what it appeared to be worth, which was, she had come to understand, the central fact of the whole story. Good, she said, and she meant it. She said goodbye to Rosa, who said goodbye back with the specific warmth of someone who has decided to forgive something without making a ceremony of it. She walked out the front door. Through the window, Ethan watched her go. She turned left on the sidewalk and walked without looking back, toward wherever she'd parked, in the general direction of the Pryor Street site where Patricia Solis had told a site manager his park plan needed work, in the neighborhood that was changing and not changing simultaneously, the way everything changes. Some of it lost, some of it held, the line between them drawn by the people who stayed long enough to have opinions about where it should go. He rolled back under the truck. The coolant leak was in the lower radiator hose, a slow one, the kind that hides itself in normal operating conditions and only announces itself under load. He had found it 20 minutes ago and was now in the process of confirming it before he called the owner, because he didn't like making calls until he was certain. He worked in the familiar quiet of the garage. Antoine was at the other lift, working through something with a timing chain. Rosa was at her desk. The radio played something indistinct. Outside, the spring morning was doing what spring mornings did, moving through its light in the slow and different way of weather that has no investment in what it illuminates. On the other side of the steel door, the prototype sat in its room. Finished. The solution to a problem that had taken years to solve, waiting now in a different way, not for completion, but for what came next, which was its own kind of waiting, which was fine. Some things you build to solve a problem, some things you build to prove something is possible. And some things you build because there is a person who thought it was a good idea, who helped you paint the sign, who said this is where you should be in the clear voice of someone who had thought about it and found it true. And because the truest way you know to honor that is to stay in the place where they were right about you and keep doing the work until it's done. The garage was standing, the work was not finished. That was enough. That was, in the specific way of real things rather than resolved things, exactly enough. He tightened the clamp. He noted it. He rolled out and reached for his phone to call the owner. Outside, Riverton went about its Saturday.